The Langeese Empire. Against the background of other maritime powers, it stands out for its thriving and distinctive culture. The sons and daughters of the ruling house, which laid the foundation of the future state, have long ruled the Langeese Empire thanks to their outstanding magical abilities. Two men were sitting at the table. The one with long hair was a prince, and the older one was an emperor. The prince asked him if he had already received the news of the fire in the east. The older man replied that he had, and then added that he had heard that the prince had already been there. He replied that fortunately, it turned out that the fire was not serious, so it was quickly put out. The emperor said that he was glad that everything had worked out. Then he gave a sign to his servant, and he went to a trumpet and said something. Meanwhile, the prince said that he had helped, so the forest was partially installed. Then he turned to the emperor and said that it would be much more effective if he went there personally and made it rain. Lantes is a place where the emperor uses his great power exclusively for the people. Meanwhile, a woman in the kitchen was listening to an order from a servant through the pipe. Then she said loudly to the whole kitchen that more roast duck had to be prepared for the imperial palace. Then she said that the kitchen could not cope, so let them move faster. The girl was carrying the hot soup, but she couldn't hold it because her hands were burning. She screamed in pain and dropped the pot and only realized it later. When the soup almost landed, a maid caught it by the handle and asked if the other one was okay. The girl who had dropped the pot looked at her in shock, and after recovering a bit, said she was fine and thanked her. But then there was a new surprise. The maid was in a hurry when she carried the dishes and as a result caught the bottom of her dress. The plates started flying down, ready to break. The woman who reported it started yelling at the maid. She asked the newcomer what she was doing and whether she realized that her annual salary would not be enough to pay for these plates. But then suddenly the maid who had caught the soup managed to pick up the plates. She stood there skillfully holding the plates in both hands. Everyone looked at this young maid with admiration. Then she thought that it had only been a week since she had started working here as a maid. The maids went into their bedroom and discussed that they were finally free. The girl who was rescuing in the kitchen walked in front in silence. They said that it was amazing, and as they thought, the kitchen in the palace was just incredible. The maids complained that their whole bodies hurt, that their feet were miserable, and begged for a day off as soon as possible. But the maid savior silently went about her business. All her life she had been engaged in physical labor, so she had plenty of strength. Then the maids began to discuss whether they had seen the crown prince. One said she had only seen him from the back. Then another said she would like to be assigned to the crown prince's palace. The other maids burst out laughing, and the rescuer thought that she would never be able to get used to this atmosphere. Then the girl who had dropped the soup addressed her, calling her by pairs the name. She thanked her and said that if it weren't for her, the maid would have been without pay for a month. Then another confirmed her story and said that she was very scared because of those plates. Then the other one asked where Paresa used to work, because she thought at that moment that she was in the circus. Then the maid asked if Paresa was in a circus group or something like that. Paresa said that she had never worked in a circus before, but that she had moved here from a fairly respectable place. The maids were surprised to hear her say that the place was as big as the imperial palace where she came from and that she was not from around here. Another one said that, if you think about it, Paresa even has a little accent. One asked why Paresa left, and another said that she must have been paid a lot. Paresa stood there wondering who was pulling her leg. They were bombarding her with questions, and she was clearly not expecting it. She wanted to say something, but then she was interrupted by someone crying loudly. The girls noticed this. There was a maid named Sarah crying, and meanwhile another girl was calming her down. When the girls approached her, she started asking what was wrong and continued to cry. Then one of them asked her what was wrong and what had happened. Then the blonde woman who was calming Sarah said that she was cleaning the Empress's palace and was scolded by the head maid, who said that Sarah had beaten the rug too hard. Then Sarah cried and said that it was all because of such a trifle. Then the maid continued by saying that the older maid said that it was good that the Empress did not find out about it, because otherwise Sarah would have lost her head. The girls were surprised and said it was a nightmare. Then someone exclaimed that it meant the rumors were true. Paresa asked what rumors she was talking about. Then the maid explained that the rumors were about the Empress. She said that they say that the Empress is terribly picky and asked if she hadn't heard about it. Then the other one said that she had only overheard the maids talking in the kitchen. Then they told me that the other day even the gardener was fired, allegedly because the Empress did not like the smell of flowering plants in the garden. Then another said that she had heard that the imperial librarian had been fired because Her Majesty had cut herself on a book page. One said that, from what she knew, the poor librarian had had all his fingers cut off. Then she asked, frightened, what if it was true. She was worried and her whole body started shaking. The maid who almost broke the plates was smiling hysterically and saying that this was impossible. This scared Mara even more. Then one of them said that after all she had heard, she thought she remembered hearing somewhere that the gardener's nose had been cut off. She asked if it was possible that he was being punished for planting the same flowers. The maid said that she had also heard that Her Majesty collects the severed body parts of her servants. It is rumored that when she likes the hair of her maids, she tears it out by the roots and uses it for wigs. And she keeps the severed heads of the maids she has killed in a storage room. Then one asked if those who became her servants did not disappear without a trace within 1 or 2 months. Then another stammered about the Empress's hair. Then Parisa thought that she had no more strength to listen to these stupid rumors. Then she said she was going to leave and turned around. One of the maids asked if she had already, and then said that it looked like Paranissa wasn't scared at all. Paranissa thought that the human race is prone to all kinds of gossip. Parisa, already dressed, was turning off her lamp. Meanwhile, one of the maids asked what they would do if they were transferred to the Empress's palace. Then another said that tomorrow was the day of distribution. Parisa lay down and thought that they would call her strange there too. She closed her eyes and mentally wondered if the Empress could not be so cruel. Then the maids asked what was next and if they had heard anything else. One of them began to tell, but Parisa fell asleep and did not hear them. The next day, everyone was whispering, and between the others stood 2 maids who had been discussing the Empress yesterday. Now they stood and announced that Ailey had been sent to the Emperor's palace. She was very happy and thanked the heavens for this. Then there was Sarah. She stood there scared because it was announced that she was going to the Empress's palace. Her face expressed complete shock. The maids around her were also looking at her in shock. She did not understand how this happened and began to hiccup from fear. Then the butler told everyone to be quiet, and there was white silence. He said that now that they had been assigned, a maid would be selected to become the Empress's personal maid. The butler said that for this moment he had been watching them all closely for the past week. The maids were fussing, asking why he was suddenly among them, why so quickly. They were confused because they had not received any separate requests. Then the butler announced that Parisa Menzel would be the Empress's personal maid. She stood there awkwardly while everyone looked at her in shock. She didn't understand what had happened, and you could tell by the look in her eyes that she was very surprised. People whispered around the maid, not understanding why she was there. The butler said that starting tomorrow she would work as the Empress's personal maid. Parisa stood there unblinking, her eyes wide open. She wondered in her mind why she was chosen. In the room, Sarah was crying again as she packed her suitcase and said that she would never be able to do it and that she would not accept any carpets. The maid with blonde hair looked at her in confusion, but she kept talking. She did not understand how she had managed to attract the attention of such a high-profile person. Sarah opened the door holding her suitcase and asked loudly how they were offering to work for such an empress. She said she didn't want to and was leaving right away. The maids were excited and wanted to stop her, but she simply slammed the door behind her. At first they thought about Sarah, and then they silently turned their frightened gazes to Parisa, who was supposedly asleep in her bed. They asked her what to do and that she must be in shock. Another maid said that it was serious. They asked if she would be okay. The butler was sitting in a chair and told her to try to hold out for at least 3 months. She asked in surprise and said she liked the job. The butler looked serious and said that he was sure she knew some unflattering rumors that were circulating among the lower class. He said that he still insisted that she soberly evaluate the opportunities that would open up to her. He said that this was a unique chance for her, but before he could continue, she objected. The butler was embarrassed and told her to think about what if the Empress noticed her, and then Parisa interrupted him again. She said that she did not like to attract unnecessary attention, and that she was basically satisfied with the status of a low-class maid. He even stood up and asked her if she had any idea how many people were applying for the position of personal maid. Parisa replied that she did not really understand. Then he said that if the Empress became her patron, her entire family would be under reliable protection. The maid simply replied that she had left the house. He also wanted to say something about her position in secular society, but she interrupted him by saying that she had always been disgusted by dresses. She showed maximum disinterest. Then the butler exclaimed that she would be paid several times more than her current position. Her eyes immediately became curious. He then asked if she knew what a personal maid's salary was. Parisa threw her arms out to show that she had no idea. Then the butler knocked on the table and took a paper. He put it right in front of Parisa's face and told her to look at it, and there was a sum written on it. He was very decisive when he showed the future salary. Then he crossed out the amount and wrote in a new one and said that if she started work tomorrow, she could get a much higher amount, and showed her the sheet again. Then he asked her what she thought. Parisa's eyes shone as she looked at the amount, and her mouth dropped open in amazement. Now Parisa was lying in bed remembering this and thinking that it was incredible. She wondered how many years she had to work to earn that much money. She smiled and said she was silly because she tried not to get involved with her bosses. She laughed slyly, and the shocked maids asked what they should do. Then the girl thought about it because there must be a reason why they pay so much money, and maybe the Empress has a really bad temper. Then, Paresa mentally objected and said that she could hold out for some miserable 3 months. The butler was leading the parade down the corridor, and the maids were talking about it in anxious tones. They noted that this time there was a newcomer and asked where the one who was there last time was. Then one of them asked if she hadn't heard, and another asked what was going on this time. They talked about something, and the maid said that he was poor, because the Oberkommandeur butler brings new people every time. After hearing this, Paresa became very tense. She wondered if she would be okay. She thought that compared to what she had done before, the position of personal maid was very good. The butler walked and thought about Paresa Menzel. He was sure that she was more suited to the Empress than any nobleman. The man remembered how she caught the plates and mentally begged that he would be lucky this time. When they arrived, the butler opened the door and announced a new personal maid. Paresa introduced herself and said she was pleased to meet her. The Empress asked again and began to laugh slyly. She ordered Paresa to raise her head, and when she did so, she saw the Empress sitting in a chair. The Empress said that she would have to perform all the tasks without objection and asked if she would show what she could do. Then Paresa looked at her silently. She thought that the moment they locked eyes, the whole world around them stopped, as if frozen for a moment. It seemed to her that she was still living for that day. Then Paresa knelt down on one knee and lowered her head and told her to just tell her that she would do everything in her power for her. Then the maid thought she had almost said that she would give her life without hesitation. The butler and maids watched in silence, and Paresa thought she had overdone it. Then the Empress smiled and asked if the other servants had taught her to do this, or if they had told her to kneel as soon as she saw her. Then the butler came up to Paresa and stammered to her and told her to get up and that she shouldn't go so far. Then the maid looked up and apologized. She thought that she had done it out of habit, without thinking for a second. The Empress said that this was not a bad attitude. A desperate desire to succeed is commendable, even very much so. She asked what Paresa thought, whether she was going to use it. She looked at her, waiting for an answer. Paresa looked down at the floor and said she would do anything. In her mind, she wondered what was happening and why. She thought that she was possessed by something and her body was not listening. Then the Empress smiled, and after a few seconds of silence, told the maid to jump out of the window. Paresa asked in surprise. Then the Empress asked if she hadn't just claimed to be ready for anything and told her to jump again. The butler was shocked by this turn of events. The maid, meanwhile, was looking out the window and wondering if she was serious. Then the Empress asked if she could. When Paresa looked at her, she realized that she was serious. Paresa wondered in her mind whether it was possible to be seriously injured from such height. Then the Empress exhaled and said that the maid spoke very sweetly. She said she thought so. Everyone here throws words around. Meanwhile, Paresa was looking out the window and was silent. The Empress said that the maid must be in tears and wanted to leave as soon as possible. Paresa walked calmly to the window without saying anything, attracting everyone in the room. She went to the window and leaned on one hand and jumped out of it. When the butler and the Empress saw this, they were shocked. The butler asked the Empress what he should do now. Then the Empress was shocked to hear that the maid had really done it. She began to yell at the butler, asking how he had found such a candidate. She said that all the maid had to do was kneel down and pray for mercy. She called her a stupid girl. The Empress was furious and said that a personal maid should read her master's mind. She did not want to see this and ordered the girl to be taken to a doctor immediately. The butler, holding his forehead, told the maid that she had heard everything and to obey the order, and she quickly agreed. He mentally wondered if it would be rude of him to look for a new maid now. The Empress heard some strange sounds outside the window and asked what they were. The answer was not long in coming, for Paresa was climbing through the window from the outside. She smiled tiredly, but when she saw the concentrated gazes on her, she became numb. The Empress asked if the maid was lucky to get caught on the tree and said that it was amazing luck. She then asked how she had managed to climb the wall. Meanwhile, the servants standing outside looked at Paresa and did not understand what was happening. The Empress thought about the fact that she had jumped from such a high place and was able to land on the ground with ease. She had proved herself quite well. When Paresa got into the room, she shook off the dust. Then she bent down a little and said that she was sounding the Empress's greetings and called herself Paresa Menzel. Everyone around her looked at her in shock and remained silent. Then their eyes turned to the Empress and silently concentrated on her. She was silent for a while, and then burst out laughing and said that Paresa was simply incredible. The Empress told her that was fine, and she allowed the maid to serve her. The girl said that they would see how long she could remain so desperate. Parissa then wondered if this meant that she had succeeded. Parissa was walking down the hall with a maid, and she told her that the preparations were over. She pointed to a side down the hall and suggested that she go that way. Then Parissa caught herself thinking that this was the first time someone helped her with her clothes. As she walked, she thought about how the Empress had said that she should get rid of the garbage and stated that her personal maid could not wear torn rags. The maid remembered then that she had spent all her money on clothes. The butler turned to Parissa and told her that she had done a great job today. Then tears came to his eyes and he said that he should have warned him earlier because he was about to go crazy. He could not remember a time when a first meeting had gone so smoothly. He asked her to keep it up. The maid agreed, saying she would try. Parissa walked and thought about the fact that the Empress had ordered her to jump out of the window at the first meeting. She wondered if she should worry about her future. Voda thought it would get worse with time. The Empress said that a personal maid had to be insightful to serve her. She then said that tomorrow she would have to leave the palace, and that Parissa's task was to find a suitable outfit for her. Paris thought that fortunately her first task was not very difficult and smiled. She was very determined, so she immediately set out to fulfill it. When she was looking at the dresses, the Empress told her that she had no taste at all and asked why she needed eyes at all. She asked if the maid couldn't even pick out a dress. Frightened, Parissa stood in front of the dresses and wondered in her mind what kind of attempt this was. She wondered what she could do if they all looked like two peas in a pod. A maid stood to the side and caught her attention. She recommended that Parissa choose a blue dress and repeated it several times so that she could hear it. Parissa listened to the maid's suggestion and decided to try a blue dress, so she pulled it out and immediately showed it to the Empress. When she looked at the dress, she immediately told her to look for the next one. The Empress was already standing behind her in anger, and Parissa thought she should choose another blue dress. She showed her another one, but the angry Empress told her to choose the next one. And so Parissa showed the Empress dress after dress, but she didn't like any of them. The Empress cried out and said that the butler had already grown old while the maid was fiddling with the dresses. She could not believe that she had been given a maid who could not even choose one single dress. The Empress shouted and asked if this was normal in their way. Paris said that the Empress was beautiful in whatever she chose, and she told her to shut up. The maid mentally asked her to finish, but did not dare to say it out loud. Then the Empress said that this would not do and ordered a knife to be brought to her. One frightened maid asked again and began to shake. Paris did not dare to ask out loud, so she did it in her mind. Then the Empress ordered that something spicy be brought to her, and it could be anything. The poor maid had no choice, so she immediately agreed. Paris stood behind the Empress, very frightened, wondering what the atmosphere was like. She didn't understand if it was all of this because she hadn't been able to choose a dress that the Empress would have liked. Paris thought about the fact that rumor has it that if she liked the hair of maids, she would make wigs out of it. And she kept the heads of the poor maids in a storage room. The maid was exactly the kind of person who ignored rumors, and now she was terrified of them. Parissa had a headache and began to wonder if she could escape before things got worse. She was thinking about how she could pull it off, but then the voice of another maid interrupted her thoughts. The frightened maid, who was shaking with fear, said that she had brought a knife and was holding a dagger with a golden handle. Then the Empress ordered the maid to cut and pointed to the dresses. The maid asked if she meant to say that there was too much jewelry and that she should cut off what she didn't need. But then the maid was quickly interrupted by the Empress and denied it. The Empress said that these outfits were just too horrible for the maid to cut them into pieces. The maid was shaking and asked how she could do that, since they were the Empress's clothes. Then the Empress came over and snatched the knife from the maid and began cutting the dresses herself. She said it was very easy and continued to cut the fabric into pieces. When the Empress finished, she turned to Parissa, took her by the chin, and told her that she was giving her one last chance. This one just looked the Empress in the eye without moving. The Empress walked over to the dresses, picked one of them out, and went to the mirror and held it up to her. She told her maid to pick out shoes that would match this dress. She asked if she hoped she could do it. Parissa's eyes rounded, and she stared at the Empress in awe. She thought that the girl was very beautiful. But before she could recover, the Empress held out a knife right in front of her face. She told the maid to make a good choice, otherwise she would lose an eye. At that moment, the maid could think of only one thing. She was silent for a while, and then asked with wide eyes if the Empress would like to choose herself. She was frightened, but she dared to say it anyway at a time when a sharp dagger was shining right in front of her face. The shocked Empress asked what she had said. Parissa then said that even if she chose, she would end up wasting her precious time. She thought that if the Empress's beauty were to deteriorate as a result of her unwise choice, it would not be the end she, as a sincere and devoted maid, could wish for. The Empress then asked if she was now opposing her order. Parissa lowered her head and apologized, saying that she could not do it. The Empress asked her, screaming if she wanted to die, saying that the maid had gone completely mad and that she had given her one last chance. The Empress ordered one of the maids to bring new shoes to replace the ones that had been delivered yesterday. The maid immediately ran to fulfill the Empress's order. At that moment, Parisa was thinking that in the end, her duty was to always be on the Empress's side. The Empress left the maid and turned around and said that from tomorrow she was free. She said she seemed so stupid that she didn't even know her place. Meanwhile, another maid was putting on the Empress's feet the very shoes she had asked to be brought. The maid asked how the Empress was doing with her shoes, and she said that she was doing very well. She said she knew it was the best option. Paris turned to the Empress and said that she would not be able to go in these. The Empress turned her head and asked her again. The maid said that the center of gravity in these shoes was very offset, so it would be very easy to lose balance and fall. She said it would be better to find another pair. The Empress laughed angrily and asked if she was serious. She began to approach the maid abruptly and shouted at her, asking if she really wanted to die. She said that she would have her way and that she would personally fulfill her wish. But before she could finish her sentence, her foot twisted. She began to fall, and a frightened maid screamed behind her. Paris stared in shock for a second, and then reacted quickly and managed to catch the Empress. She wondered if this was her chance. She held the Empress close to her and said that she had warned her that the shoes were very unstable. She looked at the Empress calmly, while the Empress did not even look at her, and her cheeks turned very pink. She sat like that for a second, and then her face became angry. She was so angry that beads of sweat began to run down her face. Then she angrily called the butler at the top of her voice and ordered him to take Parisa away right away. Paris came into the room with the other maids. She looked tired and dark circles could be seen under her eyes. As she entered the room, she exhaled and thought about how hard the day had been. The maids immediately called her name, and she greeted everyone. They started asking how she was and if she was okay. When they didn't get an immediate answer, they ran up to Parisa, and one of them even put her hands on her. She told them not to tell the maid that she jumped out of the window today. The maid said they had been told that someone had seen her lifeless body stuck in a tree. The agitated girl said that the thought of Parisa breaking her arms and legs made them very nervous. An agitated Parisa wondered if the rumors had spread so quickly. She told the maids to calm down and pointed to herself, saying that they could see she was fine. She said it was all just a stupid rumor. Then they began to ask about the account of the Empress waving a knife. They asked if this meant that it was all just slander. Then Parisa smiled awkwardly and said that it was true. This shocked the maids, and they immediately began to ask questions, not believing it. Then one of the maids said that they had heard rumors that the Empress had promised to cut out her eye if she made a mistake. One asked Parisa what to do now. She said it was terrible and asked if she was okay. Parisa held her head and asked herself if she really knew nothing, because she didn't. Parisa thought that they were right. She remembered how the Empress had pointed a dagger right in front of her face and threatened to take out her eye. The maid thought that when the Empress pointed the knife at her, she could not see the intention to harm her in her eyes. She thought that there was something completely different in the Empress's eyes. Then a cat with a bow around its neck appeared in her imagination, aggressively resisting. Parisa felt something similar when she looked into the Empress's eyes. One maid asked Parisa if she was okay. Another said that she was not with them and seemed to be in too much shock. Meanwhile, Parisa was thinking about how the Empress was very giddy at the time. Parisa opened her locker and told the maids that they had nothing to worry about because she was leaving. She was thinking about the fact that she had actually been fired. The maids supported her and said it was a good idea. One of them said that Parisa's safety was above all else. She said that if she made even one mistake, she would definitely become like the others. Before the maid could finish speaking, they were distracted by a knock at the door. Then one of the maids asked who came at this time. The door was gently opened, and the butler entered the room and then closed it behind him. He turned to Parisa and asked her to pack her things urgently. Then the maid asked again. The butler, adjusting his glasses, said that she was moving and would have to go to the Empress's palace. In the end, he added that this was the Empress's order, and in the future, she should become her closest assistant. The next day, Parisa was walking down the corridor and heard the maids talking about her. When they saw Parisa, they immediately began to discuss that she was the maid from yesterday, and they thought she had been fired. She thought that this was strange, because yesterday the Empress had ordered the butler to take her away. By the Empress order, she was to become the closest servant in the near future. She wondered what was going on in the Empress's mind. Standing in the corridor, Parisa heard a woman's voice addressing her. When she turned her head, she saw the Empress with a butler standing behind her. Then the Empress asked her what she was doing here. The maid then turned to the Empress and asked her, leaning over slightly, how she had slept last night. The Empress looked at her with a neutral face and did not answer. Then the maid looked at her inquiringly, smiling through her strength. The Empress sighed and thought that the maid was holding up well after yesterday. Then she said she would tell her about her duties. The Empress sat on the sofa while the maid stood opposite. The Empress said that from now on Paresa was in charge of the tea room and that every day after her morning meal she should bring her a cup of tea. Finally, she asked if the maid could handle it. Paris said she would do her best. In her mind, she wondered if the Empress would not mention what had happened yesterday. She thought that she didn't even seem to be in a bad mood. Then the Empress pointed and said that the maid would bring her tea immediately, and she quickly agreed. Parisa made the tea and poured it into a cup. As the Empress watched, she thought that this was a completely different matter from choosing outfits. Parisa thought that today she would make up for yesterday's mistake. Parisa was carefully pouring tea into the cup. As the tea was poured, the flowers in the cup swayed gently inside the liquid. Parisa watched this and thought that this was a perfect tea that was perfect. Then she was distracted by someone calling Parisa by name. Parisa asked again, and she said that she did not have time to finish this tea here, because Parisa finished instead, calling it unsurpassed. Then she added that it even matched the Empress's hair color. Then the maid said that she thought Parisa would fly away as soon as this tea saw the light of day. Shocked, Parisa asked why. She said that it had the color that would suit the Empress perfectly. Then the maid sighed and said that this task was very difficult. Then Parisa mentally asked what floral scent the Empress has been favoring lately, asked what mood she was in today, what color she liked the most right now. As a result, it is very difficult to take into account all possible factors and prepare carefully. Then Parisa said that it means it is difficult to cope even with a cup of tea. The two maids were looking at different types of tea. Then Parisa asked if it made sense to choose tea leaves that had a beneficial effect on the body and mind. The maid told her to be quiet. Then Parisa said that it must have been difficult for the Empress to scream and tear her dress so much after everything that happened yesterday. The maid began to stammer and said that Parisa was watching what she was saying because the Empress could hear. Then the maid pointed to some tea and asked another if it would suit the Empress. The Empress held a cup of tea in her hands and slowly raised it to her lips, tasting the contents. After she had tasted it a little, she thought about it, and then Pesta asked her how it was. The Empress waited a while and then smiled and said that she liked it. She said it gave her soul peace. Both the maids and the butler were shocked by what the Empress said. Then she put the cup down on the table and said that even if the maid is not very good at reading the atmosphere, it seems that there are still things she is good at. Then the Empress stood up and slowly began to walk over to Parisa. She touched the maid's shoulder with one hand and addressed her by name. She said that in the future she would entrust many other duties to her. The Empress smiled sweetly and asked if the maid was ready to follow her everywhere. Parisa did not answer for some time, but then she clearly said that she was ready. She smiled back at the Empress and said that she would be very happy to follow her. The Empress smiled and said this sounded very promising. Meanwhile, the maid and butler who were standing behind her were shocked and embarrassed. The Empress then suggested that the maid move on and asked if she was ready. Paris resolutely said that she would do whatever she ordered. The butler and maid continued to watch in shock, not understanding what had changed in such a short time. She walked in nature and thought that, as expected, the rumors were greatly exaggerated because she simply had an innate talent for this work. She couldn't believe that the Empress, who was so picky, liked her choice. She thought that the Empress could not help but realize this. She believed that a more loyal maid could not be found and that she was simply irreplaceable. The butler turned to the Empress and apologetically asked her what she was thinking. The Empress asked again with a smile. Then the butler said that anyone who was asked would say that she was not behaving as usual. He said that she had suddenly decided to bring a new maid to the palace. She looked at him and said that she had just changed her mind. In fact, she remembered the maid saying that the shoes were uncomfortable, and that she said it because she cared about her. The Empress told the butler that this presumptuous girl had made the remark knowing that it could cost her life. The Empress was smiling slyly with her fingers on her chin. Her eyes were not visible at this point, but there was a feeling that she was laughing. Then the Empress said that she could not let her in so easily. Meanwhile, Parisa came to a farm and told the man that she had come by order of the Empress. He asked if it was her, and Parisa replied that she had come to prepare the horses for riding tomorrow. Then the man said that he had received the right message. She asked, and then he opened the gate to the barn and invited her inside. She wondered what the horses for the Empress's riding looked like, but when she entered, she was shocked. They were standing in a meadow where a large number of horses were grazing. The man said that all these horses belonged to the Empress. Then he asked the maid which one she wanted. The girl just stood there remembering. She recalled how the Empress whispered in her ear that she wanted to ask her for something special. She told the maid to keep in mind that she had to listen to her very carefully. Then she said that she wanted Parisa to personally take care of her horses. She said that only Parisa could be entrusted with such an important job. She asked the maid if she could do it and said that no horse should be left behind. Now Parisa looked at all these horses in silence. A man standing next to her said that the Empress had not been here for several years. The maid's anger was playing in her, and she felt as if lightning was striking behind her. Then she mentally addressed the Empress. Parisa was carefully cleaning the horse. Her face showed that she was very dissatisfied, although she worked in silence. She was thinking about how when she asked her husband what the Empress's favorite horse was, he said that she was not interested in them at all. And he had been working here for 10 years. He said that a long time had passed since their last meeting with the Empress. Then he asked why he was so surprised. Now she and this man were cleaning horses together, and the man said that she was doing a good job. But the maid did not care what he said and did not even pay attention to him, but only thought about the Empress, who had offended her very much. Parisa stood there with a disgruntled face while the horse was happy to have her brushed. She told the horse that it was good that someone was happy here. Then the man asked her if she had done this before, because the horses liked her very much. Then the man said that they had already done 10, and if they pushed a little harder, they would have only a little more to go. But the maid did not seem to hear him. Her mind wandered, wondering, however, that the Empress had never even ridden them. So why did she need so many horses? The maid exhaled and thought that even if she didn't like it, she wouldn't give up the job. She just wanted a big salary for a personal maid and said she would have it. She went to the horses and asked which one would be next, and a blonde horse came up to her. The maid said it was very beautiful and decided to see if it had good muscle balance. When she touched the horse, she felt that the mane was shiny and soft. She thought that was enough for the Empress's favorite horse. Perez imagined how the Empress would look on this horse. Immediately, she put her fingers over her mouth and her cheeks turned noticeably red. Then she thought it was dangerous for her heart. She wondered if she could give the Empress some riding lessons. The maid slapped her forehead to bring herself to her senses. She thought about things that were unimaginable, and she thought that the Empress would do this despite her. She even began to think she had lost her mind. Then she was pulled out of her thoughts by an embarrassed man who said that it was better not to touch that horse. Parisa immediately asked what was wrong. While the maid was holding her hand on top of the horse, which was drinking water, the man approached her and said that he had completely forgotten to tell her. Parisa asked if it was the Empress's horse. The worried man simply told her not to touch the horse, but she continued to pet it despite his injunctions. Then he said that this horse has a very difficult temperament, and if it is hurt even a little bit, it can get very angry. The man said that if you make a mistake, he could hurt you. And then immediately after these words, the horse began to behave very aggressively. Suddenly, the horse kicked the bucket of water. Then he rose up on his hind legs and jumped up. All that was heard was the loud cry of the maid, who had not expected such a sudden turn of events. Meanwhile, the Empress was sitting at her easel painting a picture. Everything seemed to be going well, but at one point her hand trembled. When this happened, she just laughed and crossed the entire picture in half with burgundy paint. Then she sat back in her chair and just looked at the painting, saying that today was somehow particularly boring. The Empress sat there for some time and then turned her head and asked the maid if she had anything planned for the afternoon. The maid said that she had no plans. The maids helped the Empress take off her outer garments, and she kept thinking that today was very boring. Then she remembered asking if Parisa was ready to follow her everywhere. The maid replied that she was ready to follow her with great pleasure. The Empress smiled as she remembered this, and the smile was replaced by laughter. She was laughing, and the maidservants and the butler did not understand what was happening. Her laughter and smile were frightening, and no one knew what to expect. The atmosphere around them was tense. Then she turned to the butler sharply and loudly. He immediately responded, and she smiled and told him to prepare the carriage immediately. This change in tone was unusual. At first she seemed to be shouting at him, and then she sweetly ordered him to prepare the carriage. The man from the farm was sitting on a chair, and no matter how much he thought, it was surprising. And the maid surprised him too. He remembered how after the white horse he came into the stable all disfigured and asked the maid how she managed to get out of there without a scratch. Then the maid said that the horse was fine and that the problem was only with her hot temper. Then she quietly said that the horse reminded her of someone. The horse still looked angry and showed that he did not like it. Then she asked if he had calmed down a bit. Then the man said it was incredible and asked if this was not the first time the maid had done this, because she only needed to sit with the horse for a while. Then the maid smiled and said she thought she just needed to relax to calm down completely. Then she told her husband that she and the horse would go for a walk, and he was fine with that. He looked very tired and said that even he, a groom who had worked here for many years, was having a hard time with this horse. The man asked if the needs for hiring servants had changed in recent years. Then something distracted his attention, and when he turned his head, his eyes rounded, and he was even frightened. The Empress was walking toward him, accompanied by a butler. She looked beautiful and smiled. Then she said that she could see that it was hard for him to work in the stables. The frightened man began to hiccup with fear. He denied it and said that it was all the effects of today's dope. Then he bent down and said that usually everything is clean. He said that she would not have to see the stable like this anymore, and he wanted to say that you would fix it, but he did not have time because the Empress was standing over him. The Empress then said that this would be enough, and then asked if Parisa Menzel was doing a good job. The man asked again in shock, and in his mind wondered if the Empress had just changed the subject. He said that the maid was doing well because she was under their noble authority. The man said that she was very smart, and the horses all loved her immediately. Then the Empress asked about the clever one. The man was nervous but continued to speak. He said that thanks to a robot they hadn't been able to figure out for a long time, this work was done. He also wanted to say something about the hardest job, but the Empress interrupted him. She told him again to shut up. The Empress asked if he meant that the maid was that cool, and then added that it was up to her to decide. She said she would deal with it personally and asked where Parisa Menzer was now. The Empress was riding in a carriage and asked her butler what he thought. The man asked her what she meant. Then she asked him if he didn't think that someone had the audacity to disregard her instructions. The creator said that he doubted it, but before he could even finish his sentence, the Empress exclaimed that he should look over there. Then he calmly replied that he could not see anything. The Empress looked through her binoculars at the maid and told her that she was fooling around with the horse instead of fulfilling her duties. She then asked how Parisa dared to tame her horse. She added that the maid had chosen the most beautiful one. She was smiling from the carriage as she followed Parisa, telling her to use her order as an excuse to fulfill her personal wishes. She said that from the very beginning, she wondered why she was acting so boldly without thinking about the consequences. The Empress thought she was looking at it like water, because it was obvious that the maid was trying to take something for herself from those in her charge. The Empress assured her that she would now keep a close eye on the maid. She said that the impudent maid probably never thought she would catch her. She laughed and said that they would see who she really was. At that moment, the butler was watching the Empress and wondering why she cared so much. Here, the Empress's eyes rounded even more, and she exclaimed that the maid was now riding her horse. She said that she was behaving as if the horse was her own. She said that this would not do and told her to return her horse immediately. She was shocked by the recent events. Some horse was licking her forehead. Then she abruptly opened the carriage door, hitting the horse and telling it to leave. She shouted out in question why even horses wanted to make her mad. Meanwhile, the horse ran away from her with tears in his eyes. Then the butler said that the horse was probably attracted to the smell of her hair. And the Empress shouted that it was all Pears' fault, and all because of her. The horse suddenly closed the door with its hind hoof, which frightened the Empress. The horses were frightened by the loud sound and ran forward, pulling the carriage quickly. Parisa walked with the horse and thought that now it was even better to ride. She scratched the horse and thought that in a little while the Empress would be able to ride it too. But before she could finish her thought, she was distracted by a sound. She looked inquiringly and was shocked because a carriage with horses was chasing her. She only had time to see the Empress look out of the window and shout her name. But the carriage did not stop, it was racing at breakneck speed. From the carriage, the Empress could be heard calling out to the maid, asking her to save her. The Empress had tears in her eyes and begged the maid to hurry. The maid stood there in shock, and only after a few seconds did she realize that the Empress was in the carriage. The Empress pulled back the curtain that showed the driver's seat. She wanted to see what he was doing, because the carriage would not stop. She shouted and asked him why he couldn't stop the carriage, and he answered frightened that it was impossible, because it had been pushed too hard. Then the Empress heard someone calling her name. She immediately looked out the window of the carriage and noticed that a maid on a white horse was rushing alongside them at the same speed. Parisa promised that she would help the Empress. The girl stretched out her hand to the Empress and told her to catch it. The Empress was sitting next to the open carriage door and said that this was crazy. She asked how this was supposed to happen in a moving carriage. Then the maid promised that everything would be fine and asked the Empress to trust her. The Empress was worried for some time and could not decide to take this step. She was shaking with fear, and the butler who was sitting behind her told her not to talk about what she was going to do. The Empress exhaled and stretched out her hand, trusting the maid. At that moment, the butler was still saying that it was dangerous. Nevertheless, the Empress entrusted herself to her maid, and she pulled her out of the carriage and put her on the horse next to her. When the Empress was on her horse, she looked at her in shock, as if she could not believe that this had happened. Then Parisa turned to her. The maid wondered in her mind, but did not say anything out loud. Then the maid leaned slightly toward the Empress, and she could feel her hot breath on her. The maid asked if the Empress was all right. She didn't answer, but was shocked to see why the maid looked so cool. They returned to the palace in a carriage. Parisa asked if this meant that she would no longer work in the stables. The Empress got out of the carriage holding the butler's hand and said that it was so, and they had already told her that she had done a good job. Then the Empress turned her attention to her clothes and said that all her clothes were dirty and that she would not come near the horses again. Then her attention was drawn to a guy standing in front of the stairs. She quickly approached him and aggressively asked him what he was doing here. The boy told her that the crown prince was on a visit. Then the Empress asked what he was doing here. At the same time, the maid was looking at the Empress and remarked that she looked like a cat. The Empress was furious. She could not understand why the crown prince always came unannounced and never even mentioned that he was coming. Then Parisa thought about the crown prince. She recalled that when she lived with other maids, they gossiped about this crown prince. The girls were constantly discussing him. So now, as she walked behind the Empress, she thought that she wondered what he was really like. As they walked up the stairs, the maid decided to look up to see the crown prince, but she found it difficult to see because he was so beautiful. She tried to open her eyes, but it took a lot of effort, and at first she could see that he was wearing a white robe and that his hair was quite long. She finally tried to open her eyes because she did not understand where the bright light was coming from. When she managed to open her eyes, she saw a beautiful crown prince who looked like an angel. He smiled at the Empress and called her mother. He asked her kindly how she had been doing all this time. When the maid was able to see the prince clearly, she mentally said that he was very handsome. The maids around him were already shaking from seeing the prince. He apologized to the Empress for showing up uninvited. The Empress exhaled and replied that if he was really ashamed, he could not come. The guy laughed and asked what she meant, because he was her son and could not do that. While the prince was looking through some papers, the maid was watching him. She found herself thinking that she could not believe he was real. She stood nearby and thought that the crown prince looked very much like the Empress. Paris even wondered if this radiance was hereditary. Meanwhile, the Empress went to change her clothes. The maid thought that the Empress was not very happy to see her son. Then she began to wonder if they might have quarreled, because she could feel the tension between them. Then she mentally asked if the crown prince was not the Empress's own son. He was the son of the Empress who died 16 years ago, and he is the brother of young twins born to the current Empress. Then the maid thought that perhaps they did not get along because he had the title of crown prince. Parisa looked at the crown prince and thought that in this situation, His Majesty was treating the Empress too well, for he had fully acquired the power that was legally hereditary in the imperial family. He looked at the maid, drawing her attention to him, and gave her a sign with his voice. She looked at him and thought that he made a very relaxed face, and then she came to her senses and asked him what he wanted. The prince asked her to make another cup of tea. Then she apologized because she had been distracted and said that she would probably get it done now. Then she asked herself how long she had been stuck on him. While preparing tea in the kitchen, she said that she continued to lose her mind. She asked why the Empress was taking so long to return. Suddenly, the prince appeared behind her and asked if the maid was helping his mother and if it was worth it. The maid was shocked by the sudden appearance of the man. He looked at the girl and said that his mother had a rather difficult temper, and he had the opportunity to watch her work under her boss. He said that he could not really believe that Parisa was a simple maid. The girl poured the tea and told him that he was mistaken and that she was just a maid, and then told him to let her know if he liked the tea. He said in a calm voice that it was rather mediocre, and the maid remained silent. While she was pouring the tea, he looked at her hands and noticed that they were not beautiful and delicate. He thought that these were not the hands of a maid who was used to housework. They were the hands of a man who had been trained to hold a sword. Then the hereditary principal asked her name. The maid did not understand at first, but then introduced herself as Parisa Menzel. The man smiled and first rested one finger on the table as he approached her. He said that he was curious and came as close as possible, after which he said that she was the personal maid of the mother. Parisa looked at him and wondered in her mind if he knew something about her. With a surprised look, she asked him what he was doing. The man did not answer, but then he noticed that the door opened and the Empress entered. When the maid saw the shocked Empress standing in the doorway, she immediately turned to her. She immediately asked the prince in an angry voice why he was making her a maid. The prince turned to the Empress and said that they had been waiting for her. She stood with her arms folded across her chest and watched, and then asked why he hadn't returned to his room. Parisa stood there without moving and just thought that it sounded rather rude. The Empress sat unhappy on the sofa and asked him what business he had come here on his own. The prince said that his father had recently offered him something and whether she would be so kind as to accompany him to several balls that were to take place soon. She was shocked by this statement, so she asked again. The guy said that it had been a long time since she had been to such a celebration, so it would be a great opportunity for her to resume her activity in public life. He said that even if she lived alone, nothing would change. The maid just watched, and you could see a question mark on her face because she did not understand what was happening. Then the Empress banged her fist on the table very angrily and asked what he understood at all. The prince said that he was not happy about it either. He held a cup in his hand and said that it did not help him find a suitable bride. He smiled in such a way that you could feel the frost go down your spine. Then he asked the Empress if it was not an advantage for both of them. He said that if he could just explain that she came to the ball next to him, he wouldn't have to dance with any other girl. Parisa looked at him and thought that he had not come to ask. He had come to give an order. Then the prince stood up and said he had a lot to do, and went to the door and said that her personal maid was making quite good tea. At the end he smiled, giving the smile to the maid, and at the end he added that he thought the other maid made it better. Parisa sat looking at him with a cold stare and without showing any angry emotions. She was mentally wondering what the point was of touching her. On his way out, the crown prince said that he would stop by next week and that they should be ready because they were going to the Marquis of Wilbur's ball. Meanwhile, the Empress was already boiling with anger. She could barely contain herself, and in the end a loud cry of rage escaped her. She said that the prince could only talk, which made her very angry, and she even called him a bug. When the maid thought about the Empress calling him a beetle, the thought came to her that he definitely did not match the prince's appearance. Meanwhile, the Empress continued to be furious, asking him if he thought she would pretend to be a bridesmaid. Meanwhile, the maid was thinking that she thought she now understood where this dislike came from. She was already mentally calling the prince a cockroach. The Empress's hands were shaking, and she said that she did not want to go to the ball. She simply could not appear there with this useless fool. Then suddenly, the Empress's emotions changed. She turned loudly to the maid and said that she simply could not have a debut. The maid, not understanding, began to ask her what she meant. Then the Empress pointed her finger in front of her face to silence her, and with her other hand caught her by the shoulder. She said that she hadn't had a debut and now she had a chance. The Empress said she would take the maid with her and stated that it was at times like this that a personal maid was needed. The culture of life of the secular society of the Lantius Empire. Have you ever heard of the world of aristocrats? To a superficial observer, it may seem that nobles only indulge in pleasure and bathe in luxury. You might think that their every dream comes true at the snap of a finger. But society here is built on difficult interactions, given by cultural trends. Fashion is formed under their influence. The influence is strengthened by the formation of alliances of aristocratic families. With a certain amount of luck, there is a chance to grab the place of the bride of the heir to the throne. It was during the debut of Her Majesty the Empress in secular society that the Emperor noticed her. Parisa thought that makeup and fashionable outfits are now equated with military uniforms, a place full of wealth, power struggles, love affairs, and hidden competition. The maid awkwardly told the Empress that everything was ready, and she turned her head and said that we'll see then. When the maid appeared before the Empress, she was shocked. Parisa thought that this was also a kind of struggle. It was as if she was taking an oath, saying that she was Parisa Menzel, helping the Empress, declaring that she was entering a new battle. The maid stood there with this wonderful makeup and seriously told the Empress that she was in the most fighting mood. The Empress was scorified and said that this was very awful. The Empress ordered them to immediately wash off the makeup completely. Then the maids dragged Parisa to fulfill the order and at the same time told the Empress that they were to blame. The Empress was already nervous and said that it was thoughtless to even enter this room like that. She said that it was unforgivable. Then the personal maid asked if it was that bad. The Empress said that it was strange because Parisa had a good face shape and proportions, but nothing suited her. She asked if it was possible because it was her makeup. Meanwhile, the maid who was helping Parisa was shaking with fear. Parisa thought that it was not easy to be strong in this world. And then the Empress was already choosing her dress for the evening. The Empress gave the dress to the maid and told her to try it on, and she tried it on and asked how it looked. Then the Empress replied that it was quite unusual. Another maid brought another dress, the last of the remaining ones. While the maids were fixing Parisa, the Empress looked at her and said that nothing fit her. Then the tired maid asked the Empress why she was dressing up and not the Empress. The Empress, rummaging through the dresses, said that hadn't she told her that she had decided to help with her debut. She explained that a debut in secular society was at least a little humiliating, but an opportunity, and added at the end that the maid would be grateful to her. Parisa stood there and did not understand why she had to do this. Parisa stood in her dress while a maid spun around her trying to fix something. She asked what was so remarkable about aristocratic societies. Then the Empress, who was standing a little lower, asked if she was mocking her. She explained that high aristocratic society differs from provincial society in that the imperial family is among those invited to a social celebration in addition to the Empress explained that the art of conversation, dancing, and etiquette. If you are good at something, it will be easy to find someone who wants to sponsor you. She also said that it was a chance to meet honored guests from other countries. The Empress smiled and said that if the maid's debut went perfectly, her name could become known in other countries as well. Someone shouted the maid's name loudly. The woman ran to her and said that she had already looked for her everywhere and asked if she had been hiding here all this time. Everyone around her was holding their mouths, not understanding what was happening and who Parisa was approaching, drawing her sword and asking how she could allow this. The frightened maid asked her to wait and she would explain everything. She asked her to let her speak. The woman shouted that she did not need her excuses and called her a traitor. She raised her sword and was about to strike, but then suddenly the Empress asked where the guards were. It was just the maid's imagination. Then she asked the Empress, frightened, when the ball would take place. The Empress asked if she hadn't heard and said that it was next week. And in the end, she added that the preparations were starting right now. The maid froze with a frightened face, mentally screaming that it was not going to happen. She could already feel a sharp blade cutting her throat. The Empress clapped her hands and said that she knew it. The maid was wearing a blue dress, and the Empress said that she had been saving this dress for a book party. The Empress said that it was the most appropriate style for a maid and that even the makeup softened her features very well. The maid looked at herself and said to herself that she did look good. Then her face changed and she thought it was not the time to go crazy. Then the maid told the Empress that she would not make her debut. She said that she simply could not do it. A man asked the crown prince what he thought of these clothes, and the boy stood in front of the mirror and said that he liked everything, except that it turned out even too beautiful. He looked at himself in the mirror and said that he thought he would be beautiful, but not to the same degree. The man asked if something was wrong, but the principal said that everything was fine and he had done a good job. The crown prince said that everything was perfect, as always, and he was pleased. Then he said that he was now completely ready, and the tailor thanked him for that. The prince thought that there was nothing to be done and he was just beautiful no matter how you looked at him. A boy burst into the room and immediately turned to the prince. When he wanted to look at him, he could not because he was blind. He said that he had come on his orders to report on the interim results of the investigation. The prince remembered this and asked how things were going with Parisa Menzel. The guy reported that she was 24 years old with fencing as a hobby. Her physical strength was well developed. Her health was fine. She didn't get tired, and she could handle anything. Then he said that apart from that, they had not noticed anything else strange. The prince thought about fencing as a hobby. He wondered what blisters were like back then, but whether it was just a hobby. The boy reported that, unfortunately, there was nothing else, and that their investigation had reached a dead end. When the prince looked at him with a question, he said that he had tried to find information about his activities over the past 10 years, but no trace of it was found in their country. The prince asked again, and the boy said that he had also been unable to find out the genealogy of the Menzel family. He said that the former head of the family had died and that was all. Nothing more was known. The crown prince thought that it could not be ruled out that this girl was only pretending to be an aristocrat. Then he said that he was worried because it was a coincidence that this suspicious lady was his mother's personal servant with such a dossier. The boy asked what he was going to do. The prince was silent for a while, and then said that he had nothing and needed to know more to decide anything. Then he said he would figure it out himself. The Empress asked if Parisa had never learned to dance. She confirmed this information. The maid said that she would not dare to accompany the Empress to the ball as a personal servant without even a little dancing skills, because they would be pointed at. She said that His Majesty the Crown Prince would definitely laugh at her. She asked the Empress what to do. She asked if after that she would still want her to make her debut in high society. The maid thought that dancing was the only thing she could think of. Parisa was dancing, and the choreographer praised her and said she was doing well. The choreographer said that it was the first time she had ever seen someone so well able to control her movements. The Empress said angrily that she knew she would not need to learn. The choreographer smiled and said that it was very graceful. The maid told the Empress that it was a misunderstanding. The choreographer turned to the Empress and said that her personal maid had an unrivaled sense of balance and called her a genius. Then the Empress smiled and said that she could see that she did have some talent. Meanwhile, the maid was laughing in her mind even though she was crying in real life. The choreographer continued to praise the maid, saying that she was amazing and it was a pleasure to teach such skillful students. Then the choreographer said they would move on to another movement and told the maid to stand on her toes. The maid easily did this movement because she had been developing her body since childhood. The choreographer said that it was beautiful and each movement was accompanied by pleasant words from the teacher. Meanwhile, the Empress stood there angry at the maid, and she thought she was going to go crazy. The choreographer told the Empress that everything was perfect and the maid had no faults. The Empress said that the ball would take place tomorrow, so she had to go to bed early tonight. Then she turned to the maid named Maria and asked her to help Parisa, who immediately agreed. So they were going to the room now. Parisa was thinking that she would have to quit and had no other options. Seeing her sad face, Marie turned to her. She told her that she had been so busy lately that she hadn't been able to introduce herself properly. Then she said that her name was Marie Donkin. Paris said she was very pleased. Then Marie smiled and said that personal maids had never been so long in office. She then asked if she could speak to her informally. Parisa smiled back at her and agreed, saying that she could talk as she felt comfortable. She thought that the girl looked good-natured, and she thought they were the same age. Mary said that the Empress had kept one person as a lady-in-waiting for so long. Mary noticed that the Empress even took care of her. Then Parisa said that their first meeting had not gone so smoothly. Then she said that she was so worried that she would lose her sight, and she replied that she didn't think she would have come to that. Then Paris thought about it. She turned her head to Marie and said that she wondered if many people had ever been ordered to leave in this way. The girl thought about it and replied that the maids who had been here for a long time often talked about it. She said that none of them had actually been fired yet. Parisa thought about it, and then Marie went to her room. She said she would be back soon and give her a facial massage, so let her rest well. Parisa thanked her and thought that she was leaving, and it was a pity that she hadn't done this before. Then the maid thought that she was in a great mood for some reason and wondered what it was. Perez recalled when she was a little girl, sitting at the bedside of a girl named Rebella. Parisa would ask her if she was okay and tell her not to force herself if she didn't want to. The girl told Parisa that she would definitely become stronger and would be stronger than everyone else. She held Parisa's hand and told her that she would take revenge on everyone who laughed at her and called her weak. They intertwined their fingers and Parisa said her name. Then Rebella told her to come with her, and they would be stronger together and she would always be there for her. Parisa said of course, and wherever she went, she would follow. But then the dream suddenly ended and Parisa found herself on the ground. Then she realized that it was just a dream. The Empress was walking with her butler and asked him what you would say about it. The butler said that the lady was indeed making her debut. The Empress confirmed this and said that this was a real debut in secular society. The maid said that she felt as if she was in disguise. When the Empress asked her again, she said that she hadn't noticed during the fitting, but that the dress was very unusual. Then the Empress said that there was nothing wrong with it and she would soon get used to it. Then she asked how she was holding the VR in general. The Empress compared it to holding a weapon. The Empress explained that the gate should be light and fragile, like a feather. Parisa simply agreed with her indifferently. The butler told the Empress that the Crown Prince had already arrived. He held out his hand and said that he had come to accompany his mother. The maid stared at him and then caught herself thinking that it was a blinding blow to the heart and mentally asked if he was even real. Every time the maid looked at the prince, her self-esteem suffered irreparably. The prince would look at her, and she could not look him in the eye because her cheeks would turn red with shame. Looking at Parisa, he asked if she was the same maid. The Empress confirmed it and said that it was her genius creation. Standing by the carriage, the prince told the Empress that she was especially beautiful today. The Empress asked him angrily if he meant that she was only beautiful today. As the maid watched, she thought that this was expected and that he had spoiled her mood. She thought that he was looking at her strangely again. They got into a carriage and set off. The Empress asked Parisa how she could spoil her hair so quickly. Then she reminded her that she had just told her about grace and that it should be like a feather. She fixed the maid's hair and told her that now she could at least show it to people. She smiled and wondered why she was so happy and if they were definitely going to the ball. She wondered if the Empress liked playing dress-up. The Empress told the maid that today she was her creation and she should show it off to everyone. Parisa thought that this was it and agreed with the Empress out loud. The prince sat across from her and coldly said that the Empress had a wonderful relationship with her maid. Then the Empress said that she had to help her with everything. Meanwhile, the maid wondered who else was helping whom. The prince asked Parisa Menzel if this was the first time he had heard of her name. The maid was a little surprised at first, but then said that she was from the province, so it was not surprising. Then the prince thought that she had gotten out of this situation. Then the Empress intervened and said that it was very disappointing to hear the prince say such things. She said that he should not dare to neglect provincial families. Then he asked again and said that he did not mean anything like that. The Empress turned to the maid and told her to forget what he had said. She asked if her family was not rich and if they had enough money. The Empress said that when they first met, she did not have a decent dress. Then the maid objected and said that everything was fine. She wondered if the Empress had always been so kind. Here they were told that they had already arrived. The prince shook hands with his mother and asked her to take care of him today. The Empress objected and said that he had misunderstood and that she would not be his partner today. He asked in surprise. The Empress then explained that his partner today would be her personal maid and that he would be accompanying Parisa Menzel. At that moment, the maid got out of the carriage and was shocked by the news. When the doors began to open, it was announced that Her Majesty the Empress and His Majesty the Crown Prince had arrived. Everyone immediately began to discuss the fact that the Empress and the Crown Prince were also here. But then their enthusiasm was replaced by shock. The Crown Prince and another girl they did not know were coming down the stairs. Parisa could see that she was very uncomfortable, even though the prince felt at ease. They discussed that the Crown Prince rarely attended balls and wondered where he had found this partner. This made Parisa even more embarrassed, because they did not hide their curiosity. Then she remembered how she had shouted at the Empress the day before, saying that they could not and would never do this, and asked why she had not said anything to her. The Empress replied by asking her if she was now resisting her order. She said that even if she could not, she still had to obey. The Empress said that young ladies from all over the world would sell their souls just to hold the hand of the Crown Prince, and she personally gave him to her for the whole evening. Then the maid turned to the prince and said that he probably didn't like the fact that his partner would be just a maid. Then he said indifferently that he didn't care. He thought it would even make it easier to keep an eye on her. Then he held out his hand to her and told her that he thought she could not be shy and trust her heart. He asked her if she agreed. The maid was standing there with a red face, thinking that his face had blinded her again. Parisa thought that his face had blinded her again. She remembered that she was thinking about it again and that it was stupid. She reflected that the Crown Prince spoke as if they had known each other since childhood. They walked down the stairs and he looked at her while she was thinking, but then suddenly she was distracted. Opposite them stood many girls who greeted him and asked him how he had been doing all this time. The prince smiled at them and said with a beaming face that they hadn't seen each other for a long time and asked how they were. A girl with dark hair who stood in front of everyone said that she was very happy to see the prince after a long time had passed. She was happy that the prince had finally come to the ball. While Parisa looked at him angrily, he told the girl that he was very flattered by her words. But then suddenly his voice grew colder and he pointed to his mother and said that they should first meet Her Majesty the Empress, not him. The Empress looked calm but serious. Then the girls turned to the Empress and pretended that they had not noticed her before. Then the same girl with dark hair greeted the Empress and asked how she was. The girl smiled at the Empress and said that she was afraid that she might interfere with her usual carefree pastime. She said she must have jumped to conclusions. Meanwhile, another girl was standing behind her, smiling, but it was clear that she was not sincere and did not like the way the dark-haired girl was making friends with the Empress. The Empress was silent and looked at the girl with a cold gaze, which might have even frightened her a little. The dark-haired girl did not continue her monologue towards the Empress and turned to the prince. She curiously asked who the lady next in was. She said that it was the first time she had seen this girl, and if no one minded, it would be nice if he introduced her. The prince calmly looked at Parisa and said that she was the Empress's personal maid. He informed her that this was her debut in high society and that she was his companion. Then the maid curtsied slightly and introduced herself as Paise Menzel and said that she was pleased to meet him. The girl in front of me asked again and then looked at the one behind her, who immediately looked away. She said that Parisa was very lucky because she was just making her debut and already she was His Majesty's companion. Then a blonde girl standing a little behind her said that maybe she should become a personal maid too. Paris tried to stand steadfastly, not showing any emotion. Then the blonde girl said that this was the first time she had heard of the name Menzel. The other girl confirmed this by saying that she didn't know either because there was no one with that name among the aristocratic families of the capital. But before she could finish, Parisa interrupted her and said that she was from the province, so there was nothing surprising about it. Then the blonde girl mockingly apologized and said that they knew little about such remote places. The other asked how she would live in the capital and how long it would take to get to her homeland by carriage. Paris simply kept silent, and the blonde lady covered her lips with a fan and said that she looked very sophisticated for a peasant woman. She told Parisa that she did not want to offend her and that she did not mean it. The lady said that Parisa must have been very nervous about her debut. Paris stood angry inside, thinking that she now understood why the Empress did not like balls. She remembered how the Empress had told the prince not to dare humiliate the provincial families. Then the maid began to wonder if she had said this because she had anticipated something like this. Then the Empress flicked her fan and said that the maid was certainly worried. She smiled and said that this was why Parissa was the most interesting person among all the ladies here. Then her face hardened, and she said in a cold tone that it didn't matter whether the maid was a capital aristocrat or provincial, and then asked if that was the only thing that bothered them. Then the dark-haired lady said that it was her mistake and that the Empress seemed to have a special relationship with her maid. And then she added that the Empress is very sensitive to everything the maids say. The blonde lady standing a little behind said that she was not serious and apologized. Parissa stood there with an embarrassed face and did not understand what it was. Then the prince noticed her, and she seemed to be burning with anger. Meanwhile, the maid was wondering in her mind how they could afford to speak so arrogantly to the Empress. What is power? The Aegis Sea washes 3 states. The blessing of the god of the sea is the power granted in his name. The blessing, in keeping with its true essence, is something that is given only to the chosen ones who have the appropriate qualities. And naturally, these people are always objects of admiration because of their capabilities. Later, this gift of God became the personification of state power. The crown prince looked at the maid and thought that, although he was just a little bit afraid of her, she had a power similar to God's blessing. But then a lady interrupted his thoughts and said that she thought the same way. The girl put her hand to her chest shyly and said that she thought Lady Parissa looked beautiful tonight. She said that she really thought so, and that of all the ladies at the ball, Parissa looked the best. This surprised Parissa and the Empress. The girl said that she wondered who had worked so hard on her image, but it turned out that the Empress had personally taken care of it. The lady looked very innocent and smilingly said that she congratulated Parissa on her debut from the bottom of her heart. The Empress's cheeks also turned pink, and she said that the girl was very perceptive. Then she asked if she was the Countess of Bocher and if that was correct. She was surprised and asked if the Empress remembered her. She said that of course she did, and she had been present at her debut. The girl said that she was honored, but then she was suddenly interrupted by the blonde who had been mocking the maid earlier. The blonde stepped forward a little bit, leaning against the girl and smiling. She apologized for interrupting their very nice conversation, but she felt that they were wasting the Empress's time. Then she said that they would probably leave and not disturb her. The crown prince agreed and said that they would be opening the ball soon. He said he hoped they would all have fun tonight. The girls curtsied in farewell and said they were very grateful, and then said they would leave. Parissa was very angry, and she thought that they had been arrogant with the Empress until the very end. The crown prince looked at her sideways and wondered if she had released this energy without knowing it. Then the maid turned to the Empress and asked what the hell they were doing. She said that such ill-mannered behavior should be put down. The Empress calmly said that this was enough and that she should just get ready for the first dance. Then the crown prince smilingly turned his back on the maid and asked her if she was ready to call her lady personal maid. She turned her head to him and looked at him in shock, asking what it was. Then the Empress pointed at her and asked why she was surprised. The Empress said that the capital's balls are opened by a member of the imperial family. She then noted that she was the prince's partner tonight. These words struck the maid's body like a bolt of lightning. Then Her Majesty said that if Parissa understood everything, she should leave as soon as possible, because the music was already playing. Paris stood with her hands over her face as if crying. She thought that this moment had come and that her opponent in this duel would be the crown prince. She also thought that if she did not dance and entertain others, the Empress would be in a better mood. Then the maid went to the prince and said that she had to warn him about something. He held out his hand and hummed in question. She put her hand in his palm and said that she could trample on his feet, and it would be very painful for him. Her face was flushed, and he was looking down at her, and then he was surprised. He was looking at her, and his cheeks were also a little red. And then suddenly he started laughing. She said, embarrassed, that she wasn't joking, that she had just learned to dance last Sunday, and then added that she was heavy. He cleared his throat after laughing and thought it was clever. Then he reached out again and took her small, fragile hand in his. He said that he would try not to let this happen, and then he put his arm around her waist, pulling her close to him. He leaned right over her face and smilingly said that he also had to warn her about something. They danced to the rhythm of the music. Then he pulled her close to him and leaned down and told her to watch and not to faint. He said this as calmly as possible, which made her cheeks flush even more, and she felt more embarrassed. When Parissa returned to the mansion, the maids immediately ran up to her with curiosity. Marie mockingly asked who they had here. She said that accompanying the prince was a good start. Paris looked at her with a tired look and said that she preferred not to mention it. She asked why and said it was a great honor. She told her that rumors that last night Parissa had fulfilled the dream of many ladies, and she said that these rumors were spreading like wildfire. Then a shocked Parissa said that not even a day had passed. Mary said that this is basically enough for secular society because it is simply obsessed with rumors. Then Parisa said that in any case, there would be no more such opportunity. And after that, she asked if they were all waiting for a moment to laugh at her and how they were proposing to employ her. Then Mary said that everything was correct and Parisa didn't even know yet. Parisa looked at her questioningly, but she didn't have to wait long for an answer. The butler came over and said that after the ball, the Empress gave them all a day off. Then he showed the envelopes and said that they were given a special bonus in addition to the day off. Parisa stood there shocked by this information. She was even shaking a little, and sweat was running down her face. Her eyes were wide open, and so was her mouth, and her cheeks were slightly pink. When the butler handed her the envelope, she leaned over with both hands outstretched to take it and said she was very grateful. The butler said that they had been given 2 days to rest, so they would see each other soon. Parisa looked at the envelope and thought about it, because she was the Empress's personal maid, unlike the others. She thought that perhaps if she was absent, the Empress's room would be in a mess, and she would cry and suffer. The maid wondered in her mind if it would be okay if she was not with the Empress. She was standing behind Mary, and she noticed her and came up to her, hugging her shoulders and called her by name. She asked the girl what she was planning to do this weekend and if she had already thought of something. Paris started to say that she hadn't, but before she could finish, Marie interrupted her and said that was great and that she could rely on her. Marie suggested that they go shopping on the shopping street. Mary said that her relative's house was nearby and they could stay there for the night. But Parisa didn't really listen to her. She wondered if everything should be okay if she was given official time off. She thought about it seriously because she was worried about the Empress. Then Mary said goodbye to her, saying that she was going to get ready. She said they would meet later at the back door to the palace. Parisa smiled at her and waved her hand in farewell, agreeing with her. At that moment, she thought that anyway she had survived a terribly tiring adventure, so she would take this opportunity to have a good rest. Someone knocked on the Crown Prince's office, and he allowed them to enter. The man entered the room and turned to the prince and said that he had completed the investigation on his orders. The prince looked up at him and said that this was great, and that he should report back to him on what was happening with the Menzel family. Then the man told me that the aristocratic surname was really just a title of nobility, not related to the emperor. He said that it was an unremarkable noble family, more or less known outside the capital. The man added that some details still seemed suspicious to him. When the crown prince looked at him inquiringly, he explained that he had never been able to find out what she had done before and how she became a maid in the imperial palace. He said it looked as if she had never existed before. Then the boy handed the letter to the prince and said that he had found it in the documents of another country. He said that this paper contained details of the death of the deceased head of the Menzel family. While the prince was looking at the letter, the boy told him that due to the absence of a legal wife, the chairman had no official heirs. As a result, the title of Viscount was inherited by his younger brother. The prince was very focused on this information. He said that he thought that was the case. Then the guy standing in front of him said that the investigation into people with magical powers was unfortunately useless. The prince said that nothing could be done about it. He said that people with special powers were scattered all over the world, so he admitted that it would be very difficult to find information about the most powerful possibility. The crown prince looked at his hands and said that unlike Lantius, where the heir to the throne is the most powerful mage, in other countries, many more people are blessed with the blessing. He looked very concentrated as he said this. Then a guy standing opposite me scratched his neck and said that information could only be obtained in cooperation with other countries. He said that otherwise it would be impossible to find out either the approximate scale or personal information. The guy said that it would be foolish to take risks and try to get information close to military secrets through espionage. Suddenly there was another knock on the door and the prince allowed them to enter. When the door opened a little boy looked into the room and apologized to the prince. He said that he had come about the object of observation and had something to report. The prince said that the boy was very timely. He then turned to the boy standing in front of him, calling him by name Claude. When he turned to show that he was listening to the prince, he told Claude to continue to follow Parisa Menzel. Marie and Parisa arrived in the city by carriage, and when they got out, Marie stretched and said that she hadn't been walking in the city center for a long time. Meanwhile, Parisa just folded her arms across her chest and watched the girl calmly. Paris said that she had only traveled to palaces so far, and it was too crowded. She said coldly that it was noisy and there were too many distractions. Marie didn't want to give in to Parisa's bad mood, so she exhaled and took her hand and pulled her along. Marie took Parisa to a street where there were almost no people. Then Mary said that they were maids of the Empress's palace, so they could afford to rest wherever they wanted. Parisa looked at her in shock and told Marie to wait. Paris leaned against the glass and shouted in shock that one necklace was 500 naira. Mary stood calmly by while Paresa said that this street was lined with expensive shops, and that's why it was so empty. Then Mary turned to Paresa and told her that they were working in the palace and should always behave with dignity. She said they could go wherever they wanted. Mary said that, moreover, Paresa was the Empress's personal maid. She said that she had to be very careful about her reputation and asked if she wanted to destroy the Empress's authority. Paresa thought that there was no arguing with that. She thought that since she was going to serve the Empress faithfully, she needed to invest more financially. Then she mentally decided that she needed to buy a few more dresses and accessories because she couldn't harm the Empress's reputation. But then she remembered the budget. She looked at the window and thought that today she had 2,000 naira at her disposal, and that in this case a quarter would go to the necklace. Mary shouted at her and said she knew which store Paresa should definitely take her to and encouraged her to go. The girl sat looking at the pink dress, and Marie asked what Paris thought of it. Then the saleswoman said that they use crystals instead of precious stones, so the prices are lower. Then Paresa thought about it, looking at the dress. Paresa looked at the dress and thought that decorating products with lace and crystals allows for the use of lower quality fabrics. She believed that she had seen this design before and that it was used in mass production. Paresa lowered her head and closed her eyes, thinking that she had spent a lot of time in the Empress's dressing room, so she was quite knowledgeable. Then the saleswoman hesitated a bit and asked if Paresa was Lady Menzel. When Paresa heard her name, she was shocked to ask if she knew her. The saleswoman said that of course she did, and that she was the lady of the Crown Prince. Paresa then spat in shock at the saleswoman's confession. She turned to the girl and asked her who she was and whose lady she was. The saleswoman said that everyone on this shopping street knew her. She laughed and said that since Lady Menzel herself had come to shop with them, she would be happy to give them a special discount and asked if there was anything else they liked. Then Marie took Paresa's hand and said, laughing, that they would go look around. Marie asked why she hadn't chosen anything in that store. The girl said that she probably liked a different style of clothing. Paresa then turned to the girl and said that this was strange, and then asked her how rumors spread so quickly in this country. Her face showed that she was unhappy about this. At that moment, her friend looked at her questioningly. Paresa walked away with her head down and in denial. She was thinking about how this was a huge problem and she had only appeared with the crown prince in public once, and the news had spread to the neighboring country. Then she heard the voice of a woman asking excitedly if she was Lady Paresa. The maid looked up with a tired look, thinking it was her again. The woman looked at the maid with admiration and smilingly said that she was grateful from the bottom of her heart. She ran to the maid and said that thanks to her, she had an incredible number of orders. Paresa asked her what she meant. Then one explained that she was talking about the dress she wore to the ball. Then the maid remembered the moment about the dance with the prince, and that it meant that this woman had designed that dress. Paris then told the woman that she was pleased to meet her and that thanks to her efforts, the maid's debut had gone well. Suddenly, Marie's voice was heard, asking in surprise if this was Viscountessa Venus. Meanwhile, the woman who approached them told the maid that it was just that the model was unusually good. The woman grabbed the maid's hand with delighted eyes and asked her if they had such a good run-in. Would Paresa like to visit her boutique? She asked in surprise, and the woman said that she would pick out an outfit for her again. Then Marie grabbed the girl's hand and told her to agree. She told her that Viscountessa Venus was the most popular couturier right now. The woman laughed and said that they would not regret it. They went to the woman's boutique, and when Paresa tried on the dress, Marie looked at it with admiration, saying that it was very beautiful. Meanwhile, Viscountessa said that it was just as expected from her new muse. She said that Paresa had a beautiful figure, so the dress fit her perfectly. Paris looked in the mirror and thought that one could not expect anything else from the Empress's own couturier. She thought that the jewelry was in moderation and the fabric was of high quality. Meanwhile, Marie turned to Viscountess and said that she was a true genius. She noted that the dress was simply beautiful. Mary turned to Paresa and asked her how she liked it. She said it looked great on her and asked if she would buy it. Paresa said that she liked it very much too, but that she did not have the money to buy such a high-quality dress. Then Viscountessa said that it would cost 300 naira. The girls looked at her in shock and asked her how much. They couldn't believe that such an exquisite dress could be so cheap. Then Paresa thought that she had just almost spent money on a dress whose quality left much to be desired, but for a much higher price. Then she asked if it was too cheap. The woman smiled and said that it was, and that the price was for the materials and the sewing. Viscountess Venus said that in this dress, Lady Paresa would shine the brightest in the social circle, and then her dresses would be on the lips of every lady in the capital. She said that noble ladies, having won the trust of the public, would call her the most promising couturier in the capital. The woman added that society has no choice but to recognize her remarkable talent. Then the maid closed her eyes and told her to wait a second and ask her about shining in a social circle. She said that she was no longer planning to go to the ball. The woman then said it didn't matter and that she should just wear the dress wherever she went. Then Mary started shaking the maid and said that she needed to take it as soon as possible and that she would do it for her. Viscountessa asked if it was true that they take a spring and a summer set, and the total is 3. She said that these sets cost 1,000 naira. Then Paresa handed her the envelope and thought about the fact that she had bought 3 dresses in the end. She thought that for that price they were almost free. Viscountessa then told Marie that she was giving Paresa a special 30% discount and asked if they would like to take advantage of it. Marie then asked if it was true and thanked the woman. A little upset, Paresa said she had spent part of her salary on the next month's clothes. Then Mary said that they were done with the clothes and only had to look at the accessories. She said they would continue like this and there would be a hole in her wallet. As they were leaving, Paresa said that they had already spent a lot on dresses and asked if they could afford jewelry. Then Mary said that it was okay and she knew a cheap place here so it wouldn't be so burdensome. When they got there, Marie was very surprised. Looking at the shop, she asked why the lights were off and if they were closed today. Then she told Paresa that she was going to check and would be back soon. Then the maid turned her head in the other direction and smiled, thinking that it was nice to go shopping like this sometimes. She was thinking about jewelry and dresses. But suddenly something distracted her attention. When she turned around, she saw Marie kneeling on the ground. She immediately ran to her friend, loudly asking what had happened. The girl looked at the ground and asked what to do now. Paris quickly ran to her and asked if she was okay. Paresa sat down next to the girl and put her hand on her shoulder. When Marie looked up, tears were visible on her face. She turned to Paresa and told her that all her money had been stolen. The man who stole Marie's money started to run away. But in the end, he hit a dead end. When he turned around, he saw Paresa standing in front of him, telling him that he was caught. Then he walked in front of her and asked her, laughing, if she was from the palace and if she was a rich maid. The man said that it was presumptuous of her to rush after him. But Paresa did not care about the man's words and continued to walk toward him. She stood in front of him calmly, not moving, when he wanted to swing at her and hit her. Before he hit her, he told her to forgive him, but she had brought the trouble on herself. Then the maid calmly tapped his foot with her own. Then his other foot wobbled and a crunching sound was heard. He immediately fell to the ground in shock with an audible loud sound. While he was sitting on the ground recovering, she held out her hand and told him to give her the wallet back. He cursed at her and said he would soon lose his temper. He wanted to say something else, but then a man's voice interrupted him, asking what he was doing here. The man said that they had assigned him one single miserable job. Meanwhile, the man was sitting on the ground looking at them angrily. Then the 3 men looked at him in surprise and asked what happened to his face, because it was covered with dirt and scratches. They asked him if he had molested a girl and got hit in the face for it. Meanwhile, Paresa just exhaled while listening to this. The other man of the trio said that he was certainly not handsome, but this was too much. Then one of the men came up to Paresa and took her by the chin, smiled and asked if she was too picky. He smiled slyly and said that she was fine. Meanwhile, the maid just looked him in the eye without showing any emotion. This man turned to the man who stole the wallet and hit him on the head and said he was a fool. He asked him if he was that stupid and said that a girl like that doesn't need to be looked after. Then the man ran his hand along the ribbon from the maid's necktie. He said that with this one you can just take everything you have and run away. She stood there silently looking at him angrily, and he said that judging by it, she had a lot of money. Then Paresa swung her leg at him and hit him right in the neck with all her strength. The man fell to the ground, facing her. The men around him looked on in shock. Immediately after what the maid did, they turned their shocked gazes to her. While she was looking at her husband's body lying on the ground, unmoving, the men decided to attack her. When Paresa noticed this, a light began to glow around her. The men looked at her in shock, thinking that they could not even move a finger. She headed in their direction. Blue magic was swirling around her, and she looked at them with a cold look and said that she could not tolerate such bad guys as them. The man who had stolen the wallet fell to the ground, and his legs were shaking. She told him that the men had stolen his hard-earned money. And then she ordered him to give her the wallet, and he obediently handed it over. The maid took the wallet from the man. She looked down at them and told him to live honestly. She said in a cold voice that if she ever saw them again, she promised that they would not get off so easily. Then Paresa's ear heard Marie's voice, shouting for the guards to come and that they were here. When Mary saw Paresa, she turned to her and asked her loudly if she was okay. Mary brought 3 guards with her. Then the girl asked what happened here and what happened to these men. Perez immediately began to excuse herself, but it was hard for her to do so, because there were 3 men standing behind her, shaking with fear and disfigured. When the maid was approached by a guard who was in the prince's office, named Claude, she immediately began to explain everything in a confused manner. Paresa said that they had stolen Marie's purse and she had run after them. The maid assured her that the men had fought with each other because they could not divide the stolen goods. Then the man said he understood everything and asked if she was injured. The other guards took the men away, and they said that the maid had beaten them. Claude bent down and apologized, saying that they should pay more attention to public safety. He then raised his head and turned to the maid and apologized for asking this on her day off, but if she could follow them to the police station. Perez was shocked by this and asked again, and Marie asked why. Then Claude said that the criminals they had just arrested had been wanted for a long time and that they had dared to target the maids from the Empress's palace. He said that they only needed her testimony for the report and that she should not worry. Then Paresa said she understood and handed the wallet to Marie. She said that if that was the case, it couldn't be helped, and then Marie thanked her for the purse. Paresa smiled and put her hand on the girl's shoulder and apologized for not keeping her promise. She told her it was getting late and to hurry back to the dormitory. Then Claude smilingly told Marie that his coworker would see her off. The maid was nervous but agreed, and Paresa told her not to worry and that she would be back soon. Claude knocked on the door of the prince's office and said that he had brought her. Then the prince allowed her to enter, and Paresa did not understand where she had heard this voice before. When she entered, she was surprised to see the crown prince. He looked at her and said that he would never have thought they would meet here and addressed her by her first and last name. Mentally, the maid wanted to ask him angrily what he was doing here, but she restrained herself. Then she tried to speak calmly and said that this probably meant that he was in charge of the investigation department. He confirmed this and asked if she was the one who was robbed in the city center. She faked a laugh and said that she was very lucky and the knights came at the last minute. He looked at her with a calm look and smiled. Her cheeks turned pink and she did not understand what was happening. Then he said he would ask her one last question and asked her what she knew about Dunamis. She was confused by this question and did not understand why he was asking about it so suddenly. She said that it was an island state located in the northeastern waters of the Aegean Sea. After she said that, he asked her again if he meant it. The prince, who rested his cheek on his fist, said that she had hit the nail on the head. He said that, along with the Lantia's empire and the kingdom of Oligoth, Dunamis is one of the 3 states that share the power of the sea deity Aegis. He said in a calm voice that he knew a lot of interesting things about this kingdom. He held a feather in his hand and threw it at Paresa, saying that, for example, he knew that the 2nd son of the Menzel family had emigrated there. After hearing this, Paresa was immediately shocked, and her body began to be wrapped in some branches. When she looked at the prince, some kind of green magic was swirling around him. When the branches held Paresa's hands, she looked angrily at the prince and magic appeared around her body as well. He said that in the kingdom of Dunamis, not only royalty can awaken power. Paresa broke free from the branches and tearing the last branch from her hand, she looked angrily at the prince. She asked if he was planning to get rid of her. He looked at her and said that he did not, because she was blessed and would have been able to get out anyway. The maid threw the branch into the pile of others and asked what would happen if he made a mistake. If she had no opportunities, what would happen then? Then the crown prince said that was out of the question. The prince said that as the heir to the throne of Lantias, he had been closely involved with mana flows all his life. Recalling the evening at the ball when the maid became angry, he said that it was not surprising that he was able to feel the energy that she had so carelessly thrown away. Then she asked him again about the sloppy thing. He started to approach her and said that in this case he would really like to hear her excuse. He asked her what was the purpose of her being here and why she was hiding everything. At that moment, he looked at her with a cold look as if to warn her. The prince looked at her and said that he advised her to think carefully, because his verdict directly depended on what she said. The maid looked at him with a serious look and mentally cursed when she heard his warning. The prince sat down on the table and looked at her, listening to her excuses. She said she was the Empress's personal maid and nothing more. Paresa said that no matter how much he snooped, he would not find out anything strange. But he interrupted her, saying that she was no ordinary maid. He said that one day he had a personal maid for the Empress. She was a provincial lady with no family tree and no past, practically non-existent. And this is generally enough for work, but everything changes when a stranger enters the palace and carries the aura of a sword. The prince said that this should not be allowed. The man said that this is why she is now effectively detained on suspicion of espionage. He said that at the end of the interrogation, she would be dismissed as a personal maid. He said it would be better for her if she voluntarily confessed to everything. The maid said that she would prefer to remain silent. Then he smiled and said that he had asked her if she meant to say that she was so well trained that she didn't want to talk. She scratched her cheek and said that she just had nothing to say to him. Paris said she was not a spy and he was wasting his time and energy. Then he exhaled and said that her words had better be true. She looked at him coldly and said that she had not lied about anything. She then turned to the prince and asked if he had any reason to suspect Dunamis of espionage. She said that, as he himself knew, Dunamis was invulnerable thanks to the magic of the swordsman. Origin does not matter if a person has talent and aspiration. On the territory of the kingdom, strength is not a help for power. The responsibility to lead people grows in proportion to the opportunities. She clenched her fist and said that the owner of a divine gift has his own personal destiny, and if a person goes astray, the blessing is withdrawn. Then Parisa Menzel said her name and said, "I swear by the name of the sea deity Aegis." Then the manna reappeared around her, and light appeared in the hand she had just clasped. She said she dared to claim that the blessing was just as strong, and she insisted on her innocence. Then he thought about it and said that he knew a little about the appointment. The prince asked what she could tell him then about the heir to the royalty of Dunamis, the crown princess Rebella Dunamis. Then he asked if she still had nothing to tell him and would not even tell him that she was called the most powerful person in Dunamis, or that the people who do the will of the royal family are called the Knights of Bologna. He said that of course he knew about it, since he was also an heir and was well aware of her. The crown prince said that she was the only daughter of the 4 children of the current king, and therefore the last in line to the throne of succession. She is a weak and chronically ill girl. He could not have imagined that in the future she would be blessed and eventually take the first place in line to the throne. This is the story of the Dunamis royal family today. No one thought that the princess would gain such a powerful power. Before the absolute power of the ruler, even the current king, her father, bowed his head before her. The news about her as the most famous heiress of the generation spread so fast that there was no one who had not heard of the princess. The prince stopped a little and asked Parisa if she was the right hand of the very sensational Rebella. The prince looked down at her and told her to give him at least one reason why he should believe that she was not a spy sent by the Knights of Bologna to carry out the orders of the crown princess of another kingdom. Perez remained silent for a while, thinking that she had not expected the conversation to go this far. She lowered her head and said that since he was well prepared, he should know that a princess treats her subordinates as her property. The prince looked at her carefully, listening to what she had to say. Then Parisa said that she had escaped from there of her own free will, and that if she had not fled abroad, things could have ended much worse for her than they did. Mary stood in the room, and a woman with red hair slapped her on the cheek and asked if it was so difficult to fulfill just one order. The maid looked down and said she was sorry and turned to a woman named Countess Rosal. Then the countess turned around and said that was enough and she didn't want to hear it. The woman went to the fireplace and sat down in a chair and said that Marie could not even find out the information. Rosal looked at the girl and said that since she was a provincial, it was probably easier for her to get people to like her. She said that all that was required of the maid was to prepare a place for her in high society. The woman asked if the maid understood what was required of her and called Marie useless garbage. The woman said that since the girl was not good for anything else, she should at least answer the question. Then the woman asked what Parisa Menzel was like. The maid began to tell her that Parisa was empty inside and seemed to be indifferent to everything. Because of the privileges granted to her by the Empress herself as her personal maid, she follows her everywhere despite all the dirty rumors. Mary said that Parisa is also quite stubborn. Her devotion to the Empress is sincere and cannot be taken away. Then the Countess asked if there was anything in the world that could not be taken away. The woman asked Marie if she understood what was required of her. She looked down at the floor and nodded her head in agreement, addressing the Countess. Then Rosal added that she had heard rumors that he was returning. The woman looked at Marie and smiled lightly. The fireplace was burning behind her and illuminated her face a little. Then the woman said that the maid should always remember who made her hold this position. Marie replied that she would. Claude led Parisa to a room and told her to come in. The room looked luxurious, and the girl admired it and said that it was very large and asked if she would live in such a large room herself. Dia confirmed this and said that the prince had given her the best room available in the guest houses nearby and that he had prepared something else as an apology. The girl looked at Claude, thinking that it was unlikely that the prince knew how to apologize at all. The boy said that he would like to thank her on his own behalf. He said he had been following her on the prince's orders. It was no coincidence that he was in the neighborhood when her friend was in trouble. He said that while he was hesitating, Parisa did not hesitate to rush after the perpetrators. His cheeks turned pink and he put his hand at his chest and said that as soon as he came to, he immediately called for reinforcements. He thanked Parisa for her nobility in standing up to injustice alone. The girl looked at him in surprise and thought that he was a very sincere person. Then Paresa told the guy that he was praising her too much. She said she was just doing what she had to do. She seemed to be shining at that moment. The girl looked beautiful and very sweet in the guy's eyes. The boy started to think about something, but Paresa interrupted his thoughts by asking if he was saying that she would receive an award. He confirmed it. The girl looked at the guy with an admiring look, but it was not because she liked him, but because she felt she would get a lot of money. Paresa came to the Empress's room in the morning, and when she woke up, she greeted her. She simply replied, yes. The maid looked at the Empress and thought about the fact that the Empress seemed to be in a bad mood. Then she noticed that the furniture and decor had been rearranged. She wondered in her mind what had happened while she was away. While Paresa was standing there looking around the room, the Empress stood up and shouted at her to stop standing there and help her prepare to leave. This unexpected cry even frightened the maid a little, but she quickly agreed. Paresa followed the Empress, while she angrily said that it seemed that the 2 days of vacation had negatively affected the maid's attitude towards her work. The Empress said that if she continued in this manner, she would not see any more vacation time. Then Paresa stammered and replied that she would make amends. However, the maid was a little angry and thought that she was even offended. Paresa thought that if she had had the opportunity to rest normally, things would have been different, since she happened to be the crown prince of all people. Paresa recalled telling the prince that she had fled abroad. Then he said that she was like a fugitive. Press said that no matter how you slice it, her story was still full of nonsense and didn't add up. He asked about the fact that she was allegedly in hiding, but why would she stay as a personal maid to a member of the imperial family? Paresa said then that as far as he knew, not so long ago, she was the most ordinary low-class servant. Then the man interrupted her by saying that even a maid in the imperial palace was a very visible position. She fidgeted and tried to say something, but he didn't understand what she meant and asked her again. Sweat ran down her cheeks, and she put her hand to her chest and said loudly that she was out of money. She said that she had been cheated in some godforsaken shop and had no money left for travel expenses, and the highest paying job on the exchange was a maid in a palace. He looked at her in shock and stammered that he understood. He was thinking that he had never heard worse words in his life than financial difficulties. Then an agitated Paresa said that he could at least show sympathy for the sake of decency. Now the maid was walking behind the Empress. She was mentally wondering what they were up to now. So far, she had not caused any problems, so she would just keep going. Then she wondered if it was possible to do so now. Then Paresa put her hand to her chest and turned to the Empress and said that she had something to tell her. The Empress turned to her and asked what it was. At that moment, Paresa recalled how the prince had said that if she did not want to be fired from her position as his mother's personal maid, she had to fulfill one condition. Then the girl told the Empress that she had come from Dunamis to tell the truth. As the Empress stared at the maid in silence, she recalled how the crown prince had told her to tell his mother her secret, and that she should promise not to use the aura, and in that case, he would allow her to hide here in the future. Paris thought that she had done everything that was required of her, but she did not understand why the Empress was simply silent. Then Her Majesty asked if that was all, and the excited maid did not understand at first, but then answered in the affirmative. Then the Empress said indifferently that she had already thought that the maid wanted to say something important. Her Majesty turned around and said that she had known about it for a long time. Paresa, surprised by this, asked how she knew about it. Then the Empress asked who she thought she was. She said that she was an Empress after all, and only when she heard her accent did she realize it. The Empress said that this was a characteristic accent for the inhabitants of port cities and citizens of the kingdom of Dunamis. Then the embarrassed maid asked if the Empress knew. How did she know that it was not strange? The Empress asked what she was talking about. Paresa asked if she did not doubt her at all that she could be a spy. The Empress remained silent, and when she felt cold, the maid immediately began to make excuses, saying that she was not a spy, of course, and would never do such a thing. Then Her Majesty said that it made no sense, because she would not have been able to learn anything from her. When the maid asked the Empress again, she first exhaled and then began to shout at her angrily. The Empress said that she could only think who in their right mind would send someone like her to spy on the Empress. The Empress said that the maid was spoiled and had no intelligence at all. She did not even know what was happening in the capital. Her Majesty said that Paris's negligence did not allow her to doubt for a second. At the time, the girl thought that it hurt her heart. While the Empress was angrily shouting at the maid, and she was holding her heart with tears in her eyes, another maid began to run toward them. She looked very excited and was in such a hurry that she was out of breath. When she got closer, she told the Empress that His Majesty the Emperor had finally returned. The Emperor and Empress were sitting at the table. He held her with one hand and put the other on her shoulder. He leaned down a little and said that he was truly sorry that he had to leave her for so long. He told her, smiling, that no matter how many things he had to do, he did not want her to listen to all those pathetic excuses. The man said that he had been inattentive to her, and that this deeply wounded his loving heart. Then the Empress told him that it was nothing, because he had worked so hard. The man said that on the way back he kept thinking about her delicate accounting. She laughed and told him to stop looking at her, otherwise the food would get cold. The maid was watching, and she obviously did not like having to do this, but she kept smiling. She looked away and thought that the emperor was better preserved than she had imagined. The maid had heard that they had a 10-year age difference with the Empress, and he seemed to her to be a pervert and not of the first order. But now Paresa was looking at the emperor and Empress, and his beauty was overwhelming. Then she looked at the Empress and realized that she looked just like her. She thought that the awkwardness was obviously caused by the fact that she had failed to present herself in a certain way. Then Paresa asked the maid who was standing nearby if His Majesty rarely came here. The maid was at first surprised that Paresa had asked her, but then denied it, saying that he came quite often. She told me that he had been very busy recently putting out a large forest fire in the east. This is a known fact, as the emperor has the magical attribute of water that heals wounds. The fire caused extensive damage to the surrounding area. Even His Majesty the Crown Prince helped to restore the forest with the fertile power of the earth attribute. Then the maid thought that she had heard that only members of the imperial family were blessed in Lantias. The maid who was telling us about the emperor and the crown prince turned red in the face and asked Paresa if she agreed with her that it was beautiful. She said she was proud to work for the imperial family. Then Paresa smiled slyly and said in her mind that this is what it looks like from the outside. Paresa thought that in any case, she did not think she would have the opportunity to meet the emperor in person so soon. She thought that although the Empress disliked the prince, for some reason, took care of Paresa. The maid realized that since she was now part of the Empress's inner circle, she would often have to see the emperor in the future. The emperor turned to the Empress and said that he had heard that she had kept the prince company at the ball after all. He then thanked the Empress for honoring his request. The girl smiled at him, and he said that he had heard many rumors about the prince's partner. The Empress said that it was her personal maid and they were making her debut. He asked if this was the same new maid and said that he would be interested in meeting her in person. At this point, Paresa turned away in shock and thought that he shouldn't be interested in her. But her wish was not granted because the Empress immediately turned to Paresa and told her to come over to greet them. The maid swore in her mind, but she went over them anyway, even though her wish was to the contrary. She curtsied and said that she was glad to meet the emperor, and then changed her name to Paresa Menzel. When the emperor was thinking and wanted to say something, the Empress interrupted him and said that she was from the province. She noted that Paresa was a loyal servant who faithfully fulfilled all her assignments. The emperor was a little surprised and turned his gaze from the Empress to stare at the maid. At first, his gaze was casual, but then it became very scrutinizing. The girl was frightened by the emperor's gaze, and she wondered what was going on. The maid wondered if the emperor and the crown prince had the same brain. While the Empress was smiling sweetly, the emperor continued to look seriously at the maid, and meanwhile she was already sweating down her face for the 10th time. Then Paresa thought that her father and his annoying son were both acting wary. After a while of staring at the maid, the emperor said that he thought she was different from the Empress's previous personal maids. Then the Empress smiled and clapped her hands and asked if he had noticed. The Empress looked at the emperor and said that the maid was honest and respectable, so she trusted her completely. The girl said that Paresa made her happy day after day with her cute face, and that the maid did everything she asked her to do perfectly. The maid looked at the Empress in shock and wondered in her mind if she had just praised her and called her face a cute face. Then the emperor smiled and said that he was worried about why the Empress could not establish contact with her personal maids. He said that he would be very happy if Paresa stayed with the Empress for a long time. When the maid looked at him, she thought that everything seemed to be going well. The next day, Perez thought about how she was sure that the meeting with the emperor would end well. She was ready to swear that the atmosphere yesterday had been the most non-distributive right up until the emperor's departure. Things had been just fine. Behind the maid, everyone was whispering about the embarrassing situation. And here, standing in front of the entrance, the maid did not understand what the problem was. She exhaled and took the door handle and was about to enter, but was distracted by a voice calling her. When she turned around, she saw Marie. She told her that it was better for the maid not to go in right now because she was out of it and tearing up everything around her. Then Paresa said that all the more reason for her to intervene because she was the Empress's personal maid. Then Dari said that when the Empress was in a bad mood, she was not allowed to go in. It was an unspoken rule. She told the maid to watch out, or she herself would get caught. Then Paresa shouted that enough was enough and said that the Empress might get hurt there. Everyone stood there in silence, neither noticing nor saying anything. There was complete silence before she entered the room. The maid opened the door and told the Empress that everything was fine and she could come out, because Parisa had come alone. The maid was serious and not afraid of the consequences that might await her in the room. Maria addressed her, but she was not going to pay attention to her. When the maid came into the room, a jug of water immediately flew at her, but she managed to catch it with her hand. The Empress was sitting on the ground in anger. When she saw the maid standing at the door holding a vase, she said that who else could have come in? Her Majesty said that she had not authorized the entrance and called Parisa an impudent girl. The maid said that in the morning the Empress usually went out to the garden for a walk, and Parisa's duties included helping with the morning toilet and preparing her dress for the occasion. Then the girl said that it was just her job. Then the Empress began to shout that she had not given the maid an order. She said that she had crossed all possible boundaries, and otherwise she was simply mocking her. The Empress began to cry at this point. Although she looked furious, the tears flowed down her cheeks on their own. When the maid noticed this, she told the Empress that she was her personal maid and that the Empress could tell her anything that troubled her. But before she could finish, a pillow flew at her face. At that moment, the Empress shouted and asked her what she was thinking. When the Empress realized that the maid had managed to put her hand up before the pillow was about to hit her face, she mentally said that she had caught it. The maid began to approach the bed and said that she really didn't understand much, because the Empress didn't tell her anything at all. Parisa went to the bed and put the pillow back in its place. Then the Empress leaned down and said that she had ordered her to get out of here. She said she did not want to see the maid and that she was now dismissed. Perez was a little surprised, but said that she would not leave that easily. While the Empress looked at Parisa with a questioning look and went to the table to put the vase down. The maid said that she would leave and would have to go back to the stock exchange and look for a new job right away. She said she had a right to know the reason why she had to leave her duties. She put the vase on the table and turned to the Empress and smiled slightly. The girl said that the Empress should tell her why she was so upset. When the Empress looked at the maid, she mentally called her a spoiled girl. Then the Empress looked down again and asked her if she thought she was upset. Her Majesty said that she was angry and was taking it out on others. The maid came over and sat down in front of her and said that maybe she was, but she was crying. Parisa wiped the tears that were running down the Empress's face with her hand. The girl said that something very sad had definitely happened to the Empress. The Empress looked at the maid with a shy look and thought that she was indeed very strange. She thought that the maid acted as if she could see right through her, but in fact she did. Paris smiled at the Empress, looking down at her, and asked if she was perhaps annoyed by the people standing outside the door. And Her Majesty looked at her and thought about where she had been all this time. Claude went to the Crown Prince and said that he had been informed that the Emperor had stayed the night in the Empress's palace and that he had gone to his room this morning. Then the prince, raising his cup to his lips, said that apparently his mother's maid had been quiet because his father had not left him any special messages. The guy put down a tray with some envelopes and said that this was handed over on his return. Claude said that these were invitations to balls and asked if the prince was not tired yet. The prince saw so many envelopes and asked if they were all invitations. The prince closed his eyes and thought that the maid was quite cute. He imagined the maid to be ashamed when she was with him. But in reality, it was the opposite, and she was angry and yelling at him. The prince began to glow, and at that moment, Claude turned to him. At that moment, the light around the crown prince went out, and he asked in astonishment what he had just thought about. Then a guy standing nearby said he would like to know. The prince's cheeks were red, and there were many hearts flying around, indicating that he must have fallen in love. The man was thinking that he hadn't been himself lately, and had been thinking about the maid all the time. Then he held onto the chair and wondered if he was too excited. When the prince put his hand on the envelopes, he looked at one of them. It was as if he was surprised at that moment to be distracted so abruptly from his thoughts. Then he asked if it was a letter from the Duchy of Ayers. The maid continued to kneel before the Empress, although she had already calmed down. When the maids outside the room realized that the Empress had calmed down, they suggested that Marie leave because it was their job to warn her, and they had tried to do so anyway. In contrast, Marie was very angry and her cheeks were very red. Marie thought about Parisa and mentally said that she would soon realize that the ship she had climbed on was completely rotten. The Empress asked Parisa if it really suited her. The maid confirmed this and said that everything was ready. The girl smiled and said that the Empress could outshine anyone with her beauty. When Her Majesty saw herself in the mirror, she angrily asked the maid if she was mocking her and made her redo it all. As the maid sat on her knees in front of the Empress, she thought that the Empress was not telling her anything at all, and that this was probably due to the fact that she had not yet fully opened her heart. But it seemed to Parisa that the Empress was finally ready to take the first step. Before her marriage, the Empress held the title of Baroness, the lowest in the hierarchy. She belonged to a small noble family. But one day at a ball, she met the Emperor and he fell in love with her at first sight and did not hesitate to propose to her. The Empress looked away from the maid and asked her if she knew how many people looked at her with disgust because of her low-class background. She said that she was shunned by ladies in society and was constantly ridiculed. Her Majesty said that if she fought back, she would be called a cruel and selfish thief. She said that her rights were gradually limited and now she is only a conditional empress. The Empress said that only in her palace could she exhale in peace. She thought that was what they were all trying to do. Then the maid turned to Her Majesty and asked what she wanted. The Empress did not understand at first, so she asked again, and then the maid asked if she wanted to continue living like this. The girl was silent for a while, thinking, and then objected, and said that she did not want to. The maid and the Empress were riding in a carriage, and then Parisa reminded her of this conversation. Then the Empress said that, of course, she said that, but she was not ready. She said that nothing would change if she just came like that. And then she asked how she could come on a visit without warning. Then Parisa said that she was the Empress, and there was nothing she could not afford. When the carriage stopped, the maid said that since the Empress continued to insist, she would get out first, and she did so. As the maid was getting out, she noticed the Empress's frightened look, but she remained silent. When she was about to leave the carriage, she heard the Empress's pleading voice calling her name. The social season of Valantia's empire. It is safe to say that it is the ball of the imperial family. It is believed that no one is able to create a luxurious environment like the one organized by the Empress at the ball. Therefore, if you want to stand out in secular society, you should never miss the imperial ball. But everything changed after the death of the Empress. The organization of the ball passed into the hands of the eldest member of the imperial family, the Duchess Amer. That is why their destination is the house of the Duchess Amer. Right now, they are here to return the Empress to her former power. As they stood in front of the entrance, the Empress was very excited, and sweat was streaming down her face. Meanwhile, the maid was talking about how all the powers would be transferred to the Empress. Meanwhile, the Empress was addressing the maid by name. The Empress was sitting in a chair with a maid standing behind her, and an older aunt sitting opposite her turned to the Empress and said she was glad she had finally decided to do it. So the aunt said that they should get to work on it right away. Then the Empress looked at the old woman inquiringly. The one looked down and said that she knew it was a difficult decision for her. She said that even though the Empress doesn't show emotion in public, she could tell that it was incredibly difficult for her. The woman said that an old woman like her could not help but notice the Empress's condition. The Empress asked if this meant that from that moment on she would be in charge of everything. The old woman said that was correct, but there was very little time left. She suggested that they take as a basis what she had already prepared. When the girls left the old woman, the Empress said that she was still at a loss, because everything had been resolved so easily. Then the maid looked at the Empress and said that she hadn't expected it either, because the old woman had been responsible for the preparations all her life. Then the Empress seemed to blossom, asking if it was all true. She couldn't believe that it was her turn to organize the imperial ball. She wondered if she would be able to cope with the duties of the Empress. The old woman who had handed over the ball preparations to the Empress was sitting at her desk writing something on paper. She called to her maid, who was standing by the door, and told her that she was listening to the Duchess. The woman smiled and held the paper in her hands and said that she wanted to send greetings to Duke Ayres. Then she ordered the maid to go to the duchy and deliver this letter. The maid immediately obeyed the Duchess's order without objection. The maid took the letter, and then the Duchess got up from her chair and went away, saying that the Empress had come to her so suddenly. The woman said that she had been alive for a long time and had seen a lot. She went to the window and looked out at the carriage and said that a lot had really changed. She asked him if it wasn't fun to do things like this sometimes and said that he would be happy too. Riding in the carriage, the Empress yawned and covered herself with her hand. She said she was tired and glad that the conversation had gone well, and then noted that tomorrow they needed to start active preparations. She wondered, knowing that she was the organizer, whether people would come. The maid looked at her and smiled and told her not to worry. But then suddenly she was filled with some terrifying energy and said that soon they would all kneel before the Empress. She looked straight ahead without concentrating and said that she remembered those insolent women well. The Empress looked at the maid in shock and told her to calm down. The Empress yawned again, and a tear gathered in the corner of her eye. She asked why she was so tired. She said that everything had gone well and she had managed to relax. The Empress seemed to want to say something else, but the maid interrupted her and told her to get some sleep. Here, the maid was surprised to see the Empress put her head on her shoulder and close her eyes, falling asleep. The Empress turned to Parisa, but she simply remained silent, waiting to hear what the Empress had to say. Then Her Majesty was silent for a while, and then thanked her in a sleepy voice. Parisa's cheeks flushed a little, and she smiled, looking kindly at the Empress and saying that she had nothing to worry about. In such a lovely atmosphere, the Empress fell asleep on the maid's shoulder. Some time passed. Invitations to the ball organized by the Empress were sent to all aristocratic families, starting with the members of the imperial family of dukes, marquises, and counts, ending with the families of viscounts and barons. Even the smallest noble surnames from all kinds of provinces were no exception. The text of the letter did not contain any innovations, but there was one previously unknown detail. The ball was organized by the current Empress. When people read the invitation, they were surprised that the imperial ball was being opened by Her Majesty the Empress. When many people came to the ball, they looked at everything and said that it looked incredible. They looked at everything with admiration, and the dark-haired girl who had been insolent to the Empress the previous time said that it was not like the imperial ball they were used to. She said that it was a completely different experience. The girl said that the current Empress had a developed sense of beauty. Then the blonde girl next to her agreed. They were surprised that Duchess Amber had handed over her powers. They believed that it was likely that Her Majesty and the Emperor had become quite close in the days that had passed. The whole situation was quite surprising to those around them. The girl wanted to say something else, but everyone's attention was diverted by the Empress, who appeared on the balcony. She looked gorgeous and put her hands on the railing and thanked everyone for honoring them with a visit. She said she hoped the guests would have a wonderful time today. Everyone around her looked at the Empress in awe, for her beauty was unsurpassed. Behind the Empress stood Parisa, smiling, thinking that there was not a single person in the room who was not embarrassed by the Empress's incredible beauty. From the maid's side, everything looked even more beautiful. Downstairs, they were clapping for the Empress, and she was standing with her hands on the railing. Then Parisa thought that step by step the Empress would be able to recover completely. She mentally promised herself that she would restore the Empress to her lost authority. The Empress stood a little sideways to the maid, and she told her that she had done a wonderful job, and she thought that she had not left anyone indifferent. The Empress thought about it and then said that perhaps this was her reward for her diligence. Then they were distracted by a man's voice saying that the Empress had surprised him. When they turned to him, they saw the Crown Prince. As always, he looked exquisite and gorgeous. He smiled and said that he had not heard a single bad comment so far. He approached them, looking as if he were blooming and fragrant. The Empress noticed this and said that he was shining brighter than usual today and said that she did not like him. He smiled at the Empress and said that she flattered him. Meanwhile, the maid who was standing nearby watched this with a look as if the prince was annoying her. The Empress said that the prince did not go to balls and asked him what you would do if the Emperor did talk about his daughter-in-law. She said that she had helped him with the furnishings so that he would be kind and take a liking to someone. While the Empress was talking, the maid was watching her intently. After she finished speaking, the maid turned her gaze to the prince, and he asked about the engagement, looking directly at Parisa. She did not understand why he was looking at her at that moment. Then the man said that the Empress should not worry and that when the time came, he would deal with the matter himself. Then the maid mentally wondered why he was looking at her with his eyes. Everything was going well, and guests were dancing and talking to each other. But then suddenly the door opened and a woman entered the room. The guards standing on both sides were immediately surprised, and the woman told them to be quiet. As she walked through the hall, she noted that she had not been here for a long time. The guests paid attention to her, and thus she was noticed by the Prince Empress and the maid who were standing on the balcony. Then she asked if she was late and noted that it had been a long time since she had attended a ball. The woman looked a little haughty and introduced herself as Nishiana Ayres and said that she was pleased to greet the Empress. The maid looked at the woman and asked the prince who she was, and he explained that she was the Duchess of Ayres. He turned his head away and said it was his aunt and started walking away. Paris wanted to ask him again, but he immediately interrupted her and said that he would go downstairs and let her help his mother. When he passed the maid, she looked after him and asked him why he was suddenly asking her to help the Empress. When she turned her attention to the Empress, she saw her leaning against the railing and breathing heavily. The Empress looked very frightened and did not respond when the maid spoke to her. Sweat was streaming down her face, and you could easily see fear in her eyes. Paris helped the Empress down the stairs, supporting her. Meanwhile, the prince spoke to the Duchess and said that he had to admit that he had not expected to see her here at all and noted that she had appeared suddenly without warning anyone. He asked if she decided to postpone her trip for the duration of her. Smiling, the Duchess told him that she could not miss the imperial ball, which was organized by the Empress herself. She said that she was so excited that she had forgotten the time in her preparations. As she descended the stairs, the maid anxiously asked the Empress if she was all right, but she was afraid to say a word. The Duchess noticed them and immediately turned to the Empress. When she heard the Duchess's voice, she immediately looked up in fright, and her body began to shake. The Duchess ran to the Empress and hugged her, saying that she missed her. The Duchess, moving away from the Empress, said in a cold voice that she was anxious to meet her as soon as possible. The woman said that the Empress had even managed to organize a ball on her own during the time they had not seen each other, and that it turned out that the Empress could do that. The Duchess said that this was unusual and that they would see her more often in the future. She held the Empress by the shoulders and asked if she minded, but the Empress just stood there, unmoving and silent. Then they heard that the Duchess of Airs had returned. The Empress could hear the guests discussing around her that this was to be expected, and whether she really thought anything could change. Her Majesty was very frightened and kept hearing breathlessly that she had tried harder to catch hold of the prince, but it was all to no avail. It was as if they were saying that she thought she was strong and that she could handle it, but she wasn't. It was as if someone was saying in her head that she should have known her place. The fact that she was being told this made her feel even more out of breath, as if her lungs were running out of air and not filling up again. The Duchess smiled and turned to leave and said that she thought she should go. The prince looked anxiously toward the Empress, seeing her difficult condition. And then suddenly the Empress falls down, losing consciousness, but the maid manages to pick her up. The worried prince ordered someone to quickly call the doctor. He told everyone to leave and that the ball was over. Meanwhile, the Duchess just turned her head toward the Empress, who was lying on the ground, saying nothing. Meanwhile, she was frightened and anger was growing in her target. She looked anxiously at the Empress holding her, and then turned her cold gaze to the Duchess, who stood calmly watching. The Duchess said with a smile that perhaps the Empress had been working so hard on her preparations that she had forgotten to rest. These words made the maid even more angry, and she was already rushing outside. The Duchess reached out to the Empress with her hand, saying that she might have missed something. She wanted to say something else, but the angry maid grabbed her hand, preventing her from touching the Empress. The Duchess was surprised at what the maid had done. Then the angry girl told her not to touch the Empress. She began to exude mana, and the prince's body began to shake in reaction. Then the man turned in their direction and thought that she was releasing her aura again without realizing it. He remembered that he had warned her and asked her not to do it again. Then he turned to Parisa and told her to help her mother up and follow him. He said he would take her to a separate room. Then the maid let go of the Duchess's hand and picked up the Empress and told her to take them away as soon as possible. And when the prince started walking, the maid quickly followed him. Meanwhile, the Duchess looked back at them. Then Countess Roselle approached Duchess Airs. The Duchess turned to her and smilingly told her that it had been a long time since they had seen each other. The Countess smiled at her too and said that many days had passed since their last meeting and asked how the Duchess was traveling. The Duchess thanked her for her excitement and asked the Countess if this was the first time she had seen the maid and who she was. The Countess then covered her lips with a fan and said that she was Parisa Menzel and that she was the Empress's personal maid. The Countess said that, as the woman could see, she took great care of the Empress. The Duchess then smiled wistfully and said that she could not wait to meet the maid in person. The Empress appeared in the palace at the age of 20. They had tea with the Duchess, and the Empress said that she was gradually getting used to life in the palace. The girl noted that it was all thanks to the Duchess. The Duchess smiled back at her and, holding the cup in her hands, told her not to be shy about calling her by name. Nishiana became the Empress's only interlocutor. They walked through the garden under umbrellas. The Duchess addressed the Empress by her first name, Erica, and asked her what she thought about having a tea party. The Empress was surprised to ask if she really wanted to have a tea party. The Duchess looked at the Empress with a warm gaze and said that she would have the opportunity to get to know the ladies with whom she was not on good terms. Then the Empress asked with a surprised look if she really thought so. The woman smiled and said that of course she did, and added that the Empress was smart and would definitely please everyone. Soon the Empress began her preparations for her first tea party. She smelled the aromas of different teas and, having chosen one, ordered her maid to prepare it, and she smilingly agreed. The table was decorated with beautiful flowers, along with a service and sweets, selected especially for the tea. The Empress looked at the cups, wondering what the other ladies would like, perhaps some other luxurious details. Thinking about the noble ladies she would meet, she had been carefully preparing for the tea party all week, and the day had come. She stood next to the table and looked around. The Empress asked the maid what time it was, and she replied that it was 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Then the woman said that it would be good to set the table slowly. She wondered in her mind whether she had perhaps misplaced the time on the invitations. Here she was told that the guests had arrived, and the Empress was delighted and told them to come in as soon as possible. Something surprised the Empress when the guests entered. Everyone sat down at the table, and the woman wished everyone a pleasant appetite, and they thanked her in return. The tea party was attended by underage ladies. Moreover, there were even small children among them, as if the person who chose the guests for the tea party had done so on purpose. The Empress thought that someone wanted to show her what her level was really like. The young ladies left in silence with faces that showed embarrassment, one by one, tasting only tea. On the same day, a gala ball was held at the Duke of Air's estate, attended by many beautiful ladies. Even though it was a ball, unexpectedly organized in just 4 days, all the noble ladies of the capital attended Nishiana's dinner. The Empress had no one to blame. She could not complain to anyone. But this was only the beginning. The man turned to the Empress in shame and after a silent second apologized, then said that he wanted the Empress to stop sponsoring him. The woman looked at him with a surprised look, and he continued to beg. She told him to wait and asked him what he was talking about. The guy started stuttering, and then knelt down and put his face on the ground and said that if he accepted her help, he would never get the role. The emperor's younger sister, Nishiana, concentrated power over the secular society of Lantias. Her influence was incredibly powerful. People who accepted the empress's support could not get a role on the stage. All noble ladies turned their backs on the Empress's favorite couturiers. The Empress wondered if she had said or done something wrong, or if it was because she came from an impoverished family of a small nobleman. She could not understand what made the Duchess hate her. No matter how hard the Empress tried to understand, she could not find an answer. The Empress was finally pushed out of high aristocratic society. She became a lonely, sad scarecrow. The Empress's palace became her safe haven, and only there could she breathe out in peace. She was lying on a bed looking at the ceiling. The maid said something to the prince, who was standing outside the door, and turned to the Empress. Suddenly, the maid noticed that the Empress had regained consciousness and immediately ran to her excitedly. The woman was holding her head and asked what happened to the ball. Paresa said that it had to be interrupted because she had fainted. Then the Empress lowered her head and said that she had been too confident. She thought about the Duchess and saw her image in front of her. The Empress said that she had never had the strength to resist Nishiana airs. Then the maid realized that she had mentioned the Duchess and said that she had come today to spoil the Empress's evening. The woman put her hand to her forehead and said that she did not know why she was telling the maid about all this. The Empress said that Nishiana had been away from the capital for a long time, and she naively thought that everything would be fine even if she suddenly decided to return. But in the end, everything turned out like this. The Empress said that she had been indulging herself a lot lately. Paresa told the Empress that this was not the case. The maid thought that when the woman lost consciousness, she lost consciousness over herself again. It was an impulse that could not be controlled. Paresa said that the Empress was free to do whatever she wanted, and no one dared to reproach her for it. She went up to the Empress and got down on one knee and addressed her, and then said that she was taking an oath. The power inside the maid whispered something. She is the very person she has been looking for so long. The maid said that sometimes she would be her sword and sometimes her shield. She said she swore to protect the Empress from anyone who intimidated her. The Empress watched the maid's aura leave and asked why. Paresa said that she was sorry, but she could not explain now. She assured her that when the time came, she would tell her everything. Then the maid promised that she would continue to be her reliable ally until she fulfilled her mission. After these words, Paresa took the Empress's hand and kissed it gently. In this way, she swore that she would devote herself to the Empress. The Duchess stood looking at the empty hall. The crown prince came up to her and told her that everyone else was leaving for a while. He said that Nishiana should also return home. The woman smiled and said that she was pleased to be taken care of. The prince smiled back and said that his mother had gone to rest for a while, and then he wished everyone a safe journey. The countess told the other girl that they would do so. She smilingly replied that it was true and said goodbye to the Duchess. After that, they left, and the prince and his aunt continued to stand there. He took her head and ran his fingers through her hair and said that nothing had changed and that the Duchess looked pleased. The woman smiled slyly and said that she had no idea what he was talking about. She bowed and said that she too had to go and wished the prince good night. The Duchess stood up straight and turned around and headed for the exit. The prince remained silent and just looked at his aunt. The Empress cried and the maid consoled her, thinking that she had to learn more about the kingdom of Dunamis, that there had to be some good reason for breaking a promise on which Paris's safety directly depended. The waters of the Aegis Sea wash over the 3 states of Lantias, Dunamis, and Oligot. At the end of the divine era, the sea god Aegis split the earth into pieces. Having spent his last strength, he filled the sea, which exists to this day. The divine blessing he bestowed was divided into 3 components, which are now passed down from generation to generation in each of the 3 coastal states. Among them was a component that endowed the bearers with the magical power of attributes. This powerful force marked the beginning of the Lantias Empire, and it is granted only to the direct heirs to the throne. The component that allows you to harness the power of secret spirits was held by the kingdom of Oligoth. Unlike Lantias, each member of the royal family has his or her own exclusive, personally granted ability. And finally, the Kingdom of Dunamis. Here, people have a special legend about the founding. The blessing bearers in Dunamis are different from the people who were in charge in neighboring countries. They were able to suppress their enemies thanks to their physical strength and willpower. They fought bravely on the battlefield until the end and were able to receive the blessing. As a result, this blessing turned into power, which was given to people regardless of their background. Aura bearers have special responsibilities. This is called a destiny. Parissa was looking out the window thinking about how she couldn't sleep and realize that this is what it means to follow a duty. The maid thought that although she had received the blessing, she had not been able to figure out what her purpose was for a long time. But now she knew there was a path she had to follow. The girl thought that she should first focus on protecting the Empress, so that step by step she would fulfill her duty. The Duchess was lighting the paper with a candle and telling Baron Crowell that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The man leaned over and asked if she was well. He thanked her for the invitation and was very happy that she had not forgotten about him. The woman told him to skip the formalities and asked him how her errand was going. The Baron told her that she had nothing to worry about and that everything was going exactly as they had planned. Then the Duchess let go of the last scraps of paper that were burning and said that she had serious expectations on this account. In the end, she said that they would check how long this maid would last. Parissa stretched and said that her body felt lighter than usual. She said it was great, and as she headed for the exit, she asked if she should start working. When Parissa left the room, she saw Marie and addressed her. The maid looked at Parissa for a few seconds, and then turned around and left with the other girl without answering. As we passed by, Marie said that even though they were given a weekend off after the ball, it was hard to go without a vacation. She said that they had received bonuses, of course, but they still wanted to have a longer vacation. The maid who was walking behind her said she completely agreed. Parissa looked after the girls and wondered if they hadn't heard her because she was sure they had made eye contact. Then 2 more maids came out of their room and Parissa noticed them. The girl turned to Bonnie and Pei. When Pei was surprised to hear Parissa's name, Bonnie elbowed her and gave her an angry look. After that, the girls turned around and left, saying that they had to get ready to meet guests in the morning. Bonnie told them to hurry up and go, otherwise they would be scolded. Bonnie and Pei were walking behind Marie and the other maid. Bonnie asked her friend if she had seen her stupid face. Bonnie said that she had brought this attitude on herself, and she was sure that Parissa didn't even realize what she had done. Then Pei turned to the girl excitedly. The maid stood there with a calm face and thought that she wondered what they had said to them if the negative consequences had even affected her. She thought it was a bunch of fools and they would never scare her with such tricks. Marie looked down and thought that she was sorry, but she could do nothing. She mentally told Parissa that she had chosen this path herself. Little Livia wanted to save the bird. She hoped that if she treated it, it would survive, but the bird stopped eating and drinking and eventually died. Livia and Nishin stood in front of the bird's grave. They stood there for a while without saying anything, and then Nishin took the girl's hand and said that she had done her best. She said that she thought the bird was very happy until its last breath. Nishin Ayres is the Emperor's younger sister, a princess of Valantia's empire. For the first time in several generations, a long-awaited girl was born to the imperial family. She has always received endless amounts of love from her brother and father. As for marriage, the Duke of Ayres was her mature choice. They have a son who will be a worthy heir in the future. When Parissa heard about it, she said it was incredible, because the Duchess looked like a perfect lady from a picture. The maid gave the Empress a cup of tea. The Empress angrily said that this was exactly the case, and that it was impossible to understand what she was up to just by looking at its beautiful wrapper. Then she said even more angrily that she was doing everything she could to make the Empress go crazy. The Empress said that the aristocrats were returning in the same social circles and that they were all rotten to the core. Then the maid said and thought that the Empress said that since that tea party there had not been a day when the Duchess had not tried to cause her problems. The girl said that she thought the Empress had made a splash in secular society. The Empress was drinking tea and asked if everything was so good, she would get rid of the 22 maids. The Empress said that each of them would eventually become Nishiana's assistant. They were looking forward to it, trying to catch a moment to humiliate her. This is the real reason why she was unable to find a personal maid. Parissa said she understood. The Empress looked at her, and the maid remained silent and stood upright, holding the tray in her hands. After a few seconds of pause, the girl got down on one knee and lowered her head and said that she would do everything in her hands. The Empress ordered her to raise her head. She recalled how on their first meeting, she thought the Duchess had sent her subject again. By then, she had had enough of it, because she could not count on one hand the number of maids she had expelled. Now she looked at Parissa, who stood next to her, and asked if she was on her side. The maid smiled sincerely and bent down a little to assure her mistress that she was loyal to her. Then the Empress said that not many people had sided with her during all this time, and none of them could stand Nishiana's manipulations. Everyone just ran away. They held hands, and the Empress said that she really hoped that the maid would not do that. The Empress said she wanted Parisa to teach her, because now she wanted to confront Nishani. The woman asked what she could do to protect the maid. Once it became clear what Parisa's mission was, she realized something. Even if she doesn't have a sword in her hands, she is ready to fight in the name of duty at any time. The emergence of a direct threat to the Empress's well-being allowed her to realize this. Now, this is her whole life. The maid stood with her eyes closed and thought that she was a little embarrassed. She thought that the Empress did not share her feelings. Parisa blushed a little and cleared her throat and said that she should first contact His Majesty. She needed to meet him and talk to him. The Empress angrily asked who needed it. The maid then asked if she could have her sword in that case. Parisa wanted to tell her what she could do with it, but the Empress's look made it clear that this option was not suitable. They arrived at the prince's palace, and he immediately asked his mother how she was feeling. She said indifferently that she was fine and had no difficulty moving around. Then he said that this was the first time she had come to visit him. Sitting down on the couch, the crown prince smiled and said that she could not imagine how happy he was. He then asked what she wanted to talk to him about. The Empress started to speak, but Parisa interrupted her. Parisa bowed slightly and said that she would tell him everything, but first she would ask the lady to leave the room. The prince was silent for a while, and then said that he would do as she said and raised his hand to indicate that the maid should leave. When the prince's maid left, he turned to the Empress's personal maid. The man smiled and held out his hand and said that he too had something to say to her. Then he asked her why she had broken her promise to him and whether her mother knew about it. The Empress immediately looked up at the maid inquiringly. The girl was shocked for a moment, but then calmly said that this was what she had intended to talk to him about during last night's ball. She told him about how she had sworn allegiance and taken the oath of a knight to the Empress. As the prince looked at her, she wondered if he would guess, because in the end she was confirming that she was a knight of Bologna. She wondered if it was too soon. He asked about the oath and asked why. Then she said that it was, of course, to confront anyone who dared to threaten the safety and well-being of the Empress. The maid said that even if that person turned out to be him. The shocked Empress asked Pears what she was saying. The crown prince simply exhaled without saying anything. Parisa turned to His Majesty, looking him in the eye, and asked him whose side he was on, Her Majesty the Empress or the Duchess of Ayres. The prince sat there for a while with a serious face, and then he started laughing out loud, surprising the girls. The maid's cheeks grew redder, and she did not understand what made her husband laugh so much. The Empress thought that the maid had long since had to come to her senses, for she had been behaving very impudently at times. The prince's cheeks turned red, and he said, smiling, that it was rude. Then he asked if the maid had asked him which side he was on. The prince said that was what he was talking about. The Empress was angry and said that he was a very muddled type. She said that he could only bare his teeth, a clear example of hidden intentions, and no one knew what was in his mind. A tear appeared in the prince's eye, and he said, smiling, that there was nothing to be done about it, because he was only the crown prince. Then the Empress asked him that if he was not the crown prince, then who was? The maid explained that he meant to say that the crown prince must follow the will of the emperor. The prince smiled and said that was correct. The Empress stood up abruptly, and the maid looked at her in surprise. The maid said they had to go and headed for the exit. The prince asked if he could borrow her personal maid for a while. He said that they would have a little talk and he would return her immediately. The Empress told him to do as he pleased, and Parisa looked at her husband in surprise. The landlady slammed the door loudly. The maid turned to the crown prince, and he asked her to sit down, because they had something to discuss. The girl smiled and said that it was not proper for the maid to sit in the presence of the prince. The man smiled back and said that the prince did not mind. He asked if she preferred to look down at the person she was talking to. Then the girl abruptly sat down on the couch. Then he said they would get right to the point. He recalled what the maid had said about the oath of chivalry, but something told him that there was more to it. He lifted his cup and asked if she had learned her purpose and was now fulfilling it as a knight of Bologna. She said that she was looking into the water and called the prince clever. He said that everything was logical and it would have been strange not to guess. The man said that even so, no one would have been able to suspect her because a kind prince had hidden her aura with his energy, even though she'd have put on a show. She thanked the crown prince awkwardly. As he sipped his tea, he told her to consider herself indebted to him. He asked if she did not want the emperor to know her secret. He thought it would complicate things. The maid said that of course she did not want that. Parisa asked him how he knew she had done it because of the appointment, because it is a completely different, special aura that is difficult to feel. The prince smiled and said he didn't know. The maid asked again, and he said that although he had jumped to a premature conclusion, He said that the blessing in dunamis is an exceptional thing, and that the appointment is also a kind of phenomenon. People who have power usually use it for the benefit of the kingdom, and she, although she was granted the status of a knight of Bologna, ended up fleeing her homeland. He said that he thought that her mission, in other words, her duty, must be something special and typical. The girl told the prince that it was the first time he had ever been so open. Then he looked away and smilingly said that he was determined to build a trusting relationship. The prince said that although he was acting in accordance with the imperial will, he and his father still thought differently. Then Paresa's eyes rounded, and she apologized for her impudence and said that she could not help but ask. She asked if this meant that His Majesty was not being completely honest with the Empress. The prince said that, of course, he knew about the conflict between his mother and aunt. He said that he also thought his mother knew about it, which is why she was upset not long ago. The man said that the Empress says that he is like his father. Paresa clenched her fists and wanted to say something about how he knew everything. His Majesty said that he simply understood what the position of emperor was. The prince said that instead of taking sides in a conflict, he should try to resolve it. He asked her why she thought her aunt had left the capital 2 years ago, as she had hardly traveled. The crown prince asked if it was possible for his father to be at the disposal of his mother. Then Parisa said that it turned out that he had been justifying himself by doing his duty all this time. The girl asked what it was, if not avoidance of the problem. The man said that such statements could lead to problems for Parisa Menzel. The maid said that she had not sworn an oath of allegiance to the Lanches imperial family, but served only the Empress. Parisa said that the Empress had been suffering for 10 years, and the last 2 were no exception. She asked the prince if he knew about it. The maid said that even in the absence of Duchess heirs, those who were influenced by her looked down on the Empress, humiliated her, and spread dirty rumors. His Majesty said that he knew, because the Empress had complained about this attitude more than once. The Emperor told Erica that Nishiana would not have done this on purpose. He was sure of it. He said that there would be a reason for this, and he promised to talk to her. Parisa said that the most terrible thing is that the Empress feels guilty towards the Emperor and the Prince. She said that no excuses would work here, and that both the prince and the emperor were negligent. The man smilingly said that even if it was true and they ignored the problems, the idealized picture in their minds and what was actually happening were different things. He said that the emperor had warned the aristocracy many times, and they tried in various ways to prevent ridicule and make sure that they did not cross the line. The man said that he was personally involved in this. He then asked if the maid thought he knew more about their behavior than she did. Parisa said indifferently that it was not surprising that she did not know anything, and asked if that was a problem at all. Suddenly, her tone became colder and her face hardened. She asked if the Empress knew what the 2 of them were doing. She said that Erica was suffering more than they thought, and she was not going to ignore it. The maid said that it might have been noble of the Emperor to remain neutral, but it was not her place to look at someone suffering. Then she said she would repeat herself and ask again whose side the prince was on, the Empress or the Duchess of Airs. The prince thought that for some reason he could not lie looking into the maid's eyes. He smiled and said that they would do so, as he had said before about a trusting relationship. The man approached Parisa and said that if she wanted him to be sincere again and reveal his position, she had to fulfill 2 conditions. First, she will repay the debt during the imperial ball. The second is not to refuse his offers of a meeting. 3 days passed. Countess Butcher came to the Empress and said she was glad to see her. Her Majesty was very happy to see the lady. The crown prince stood behind the countess and smiled. The girl asked if the Empress had slept well that night. She said that it was a great honor for her to see the Empress again. Let's go back in time a bit. The morning of the same day, Parisa asked if the Empress had forgotten about the visit of the Countess Butcher, who would be arriving with the crown prince. The girl said that they had to get ready. The Empress, sitting on her bed, asked again in shock and said that she had refused. Parisa exhaled and put her hands to her sides and said that if the Empress continued to avoid others like this, it would not get any easier. She said that even though the Duchess of Airs had surrounded herself with a bunch of supporters, not all the aristocrats were on her side. The girl approached the Empress and said that they also needed to do the same so that people would follow her. The maid said that she should first gain the favor of people like Countess Butcher, and that she should not alienate those who clearly do not treat her badly. Erica thought about how she didn't want to push them away. She remembered the faces of everyone who had been kind to her, and she really wanted to build relationships with them. The Countess smiled at Erica and said that she could not afford to come empty-handed, so she brought a gift. She gave the Empress a basket of flowers and told her that she had arranged this flower arrangement for her personally. Her Majesty exclaimed in admiration and said that it was very beautiful. Then she turned around and, smiling over her shoulder, said that she suggested leaving the gifts for later and invited them inside. Then the maid politely took the basket with a smile. The Empress invited everyone to a cup of tea, and Countess Butcher thanked them in return. They were sitting at the table, the maid was pouring tea, and the Countess said that from the very first time they met, she was fascinated by the Empress. She said that she had never felt this way even with her husband, and laughed. The Empress also laughed and said that she could not even imagine that she could have such a judgment about her. Her Majesty smilingly said that if the Countess did not mind, she would like to see her more often, because she had to take responsibility for what she had done. Countess Butcher said that she would be very happy to do so. Paresa approached the girls and said that she dared them to move to another room. The prince appeared in the doorway and smilingly said that she was probably the only maid in the world who reacted to the crown prince in this way. The Empress turned her head and looked surprised. The Countess stood up and bent down and told him that he was a prince and to come quickly. When they went into the room, there were easels and the same flowers brought by the Countess and some fruit on the table. Erica exclaimed in delight, and the Countess apologized and smilingly said that she had to ask the prince for advice, and he told her that the Empress loved to paint and that she happened to be one too. She said that she had persuaded him to help with the preparations because she really wanted to paint with the Empress. Then the girl asked how the Empress looked at it. The Empress, meanwhile, was staring in awe and could not say anything. Countess Butcher smiled and said that the Empress seemed to like their surprise and was very happy about it. The Empress said that the Countess was right because she was delighted. It was indeed a wonderful gift. Paresa then pulled out a chair and asked the Empress to sit down. When the maid noticed that the other maids were helping the prince take off his outerwear, she was surprised to ask him if he was going to paint as well. He answered in the affirmative and said that since everyone was gathered, he could not stay away. He smiled and told her not to be surprised when she saw him. So the day passed, and when the sun was setting, the Countess had to go home. The girl stood next to the carriage, and the Empress said that she was immensely grateful for today's visit. Countess Butcher said that it was she who should thank her for such a warm welcome. Erica said that although it was not a big one, she had also prepared a gift. Then the maid handed over the box, and the excited Countess said that she shouldn't have. The Empress said that she would be very happy if the Countess liked it, because it was her favorite floral tea. Erica asked that the next time the Countess visited her, she should make her feel at home. The girl was surprised at first, but then smiled as she agreed. The maid was on her knees with her head down and her mouth covered. The prince asked her if she thought it was too much and told her to stop. The girl began to cry with laughter as she looked at the Duke's drawing, and he frowned at the girl. She was holding her stomach, saying she couldn't help herself. She was laughing so hard that her stomach hurt. He said it was really amazing. He thought his skills were at an incredibly high level. The Empress came in and asked what the two of them were doing here again. The maid turned to the Empress in surprise, and she noted that the girl had even knelt down. Parisa stood up and smiled, shaking off the dust, and denied that they were doing anything special. And to tell the truth, she expected more from the Emperor's drawing skills. The prince asked if his mother had seen the Countess off. She answered in the affirmative and then folded her arms across her chest and told him seriously to answer immediately. She asked what they had talked about a few days ago after she had left. The maid started to speak, but the crown prince interrupted her and said that Countess Butcher had become their ally at the right time, because she was capable and definitely trustworthy, and he had been eyeing her for a long time. The Countess married early, so she has long been in secular society. Due to her position, even the Duchess's influence does not apply to her. The Empress said that this was good for her, and then she turned to the prince and said that he had never shown that he supported her. The Empress asked him if he was sure that everything would be fine if he took her side so openly, pushing Nishiana away. She asked what about their neutrality. The crown prince smiled and said that her close maid was very loyal to the Empress. He put his hand to his chest and said pitifully that her words had hurt him and made him change his mind about his point of view. He said he hoped that his mother would be able to forgive him for his past indifference. Erica exclaimed in surprise at first and then agreed. Parisa smilingly told the Empress that a start had been made. Mirthina Butcher had already sided with them, and the Empress had definitely attracted the attention of noble ladies who were not recognized as Nishiana's favorites. The maid said that even though they are all strongly connected, it is incredibly difficult for the wards of a strict hierarchy, ladies from lower classes and newcomers to adapt in such a society. Then the Empress said that it was obvious that everyone was frightened by the unfair treatment that Nishiana was giving them for the choice they had made in favor of Erica. The Empress sadly said that not everyone is as brave as the maid. Parisa smiled at the Empress and said that she knew very well how much she cared about people. The prince said that this was one of the reasons why Parisa had asked him for help. He said he wanted his mother to be sure that he was able to provide his people with the protection they needed. The man asked her if she hadn't forgotten, and then said that the emperor's birthday was coming up very soon. Duchess heirs came to Levia's grave and brought flowers. She put them on the grave and thought about how much had already happened. Every country celebrates the birthday of its monarch on a special scale. Lantius, where the emperor is revered as a god, is no exception. Here, the emperor's birthday is celebrated on a slightly larger scale. Aristocrats from all over the empire come to the capital for a gala ball to have an audience with the emperor. Even the presence of the Duchess of Heirs, despite her undisputed reputation, the emperor's wife, the Empress, must shine the brightest. The prince said that even aristocrats from the top of secular society are obliged to show her their hypocritical respect on this day. He said that no one would risk openly expressing their insignificant position in such a situation. The Empress asked what she should do in this case. The crown prince said that she could do whatever she wanted, because she was the Empress after all and could afford it. He told her that many noble families from the provinces would be attending the celebration and she would have a great opportunity to show her nobility. Erica, rubbing the cup excitedly, asked if she could handle it. The man said she had nothing to fear. He reminded her that he had already told her that he would help her, and she just had to trust him. Parisa and the Empress entered the room. While the maid was closing the door, Erica said that she had a headache. She asked what she thought about what the crown prince had said. Parisa said, after some thought, that she wondered if His Majesty was the kind of man who would lie about such a thing. She asked if he could really help them. The Empress turned around and said grimly that the prince was really smart, and she thought he had a lot of ideas. After that, she said angrily that she could not understand why he had decided to take her side. She told Tai to wait for the maid, and then asked him about Parisa's recent conversation with him in private. She asked about what he had said to her. The maid was silent as she recalled the prince's second condition, and then told the Empress that he had asked her not to refuse if he gave her an errand one day. Erica angrily asked if he knew whose maid she was and why she had agreed to this in the first place. Parisa said that, of course, she had set a condition that he not ask for anything that could harm the Empress in any way. She said that perhaps he wanted a reliable person by her side. Then the Empress said that they would forget about it, and that even if he was up to something, she would not be informed. The maid simply scratched the back of her head in silence without answering. The prince's aide approached him and asked if he could find out what he was up to. The crown prince said he didn't know what he was talking about. The guy said that he hadn't planned to interfere before. Then the prince realized that he was talking about the conflict with his mother and aunt. He asked him what was wrong, whether he was worried about him, whether he thought he wouldn't be able to cope. Claude said he was the heir to the throne. No one would dare threaten him. The guy said it was just out of curiosity. He said that the prince claimed that it was the will of the emperor and therefore did not interfere with the relationship between the Empress and the Duchess. He was interested in the reason why he had broken this unspoken rule. The crown prince said he couldn't help himself. He remembered the maid and said that she had said that he and his father had been sloppy up to now and he could not deny it. He blushed and said with a smile that she looked at him with bright blue eyes, and the expression on her face and the eyes he saw then were impossible to understand unless you saw them in person. He said that he was drowning in them and so deeply that he was unable to speak for a moment. After what the prince said, the assistant exhaled and said that he was hopeless. The crown prince turned to Claude and said that he was going to entrust him with an important task. When he asked again, the prince said that at the ball in honor of the emperor's birthday, he should make sure that no garbage bag touched his persochka with his dirty hands. He said that if necessary, he would have the boy accompany her. This seemed to hit the assistant on the head. Then the prince said that he was warning him in advance not to even think about flirting with her, because he would not get away with it. Claude asked why he would do that and said that he also had preferences. He asked him what he was going to do if he entrusted him with this, and the prince smiled and said that he would be absent. Parisa entered her room and saw a complete mess and overturned things. She picked something up off the ground thinking that the closed door hadn't hurt them either. She noticed that nothing was missing. She didn't understand why she would do that. Then she remembered that she could not rely on her feelings alone. An ordinary person would not be able to endure such treatment. Parisa thought about the fact that at first she was completely isolated from society, and now she was made to understand that her life was at risk at any moment. The maid's face hardened, and she thought that they had actually challenged her. She asked herself if she had any reason to tolerate this. Suddenly, she heard someone calling behind her. When she turned around, she saw Marie standing in the doorway. The girl looked around but didn't say anything. Parisa then said that they had collectively decided to ignore her, so she asked why she had come now. Marie said she didn't have time for small talk, so she got straight to the point. She asked if Parisa understood why things were the way they were. She asked him to stop resisting before it was too late. Marie told her to tell the maid that she had made a mistake out of ignorance, and then maybe she would have mercy. Parisa put her hand on the girl's shoulder and apologized, saying that she had not made any mistakes. Mary said sadly that she was not joking and that she was foolish to think that the Empress would be able to protect her. Parisa said that Marie should have been more careful with her words because she was, after all, serving in the Empress's palace. She told her to think at her leisure about which of them had made the wrong choice. Mary pushed the maid's hand away and shouted that she was stupid to try to help. She told her to take care of herself. As she left, she told Parisa that even if she regretted what she had done later, it would be too late. Parisa asked Marie to let her clarify. When the girl stopped, she said seriously that no matter how much time passed, it was important to understand her mistakes, and if she ever changed her mind, Parisa would be waiting for her any time. And so it was about a month before the emperor's birthday.